Chapter 472. What is this? Farina suddenly asked. She lifted her skirt with one hand and stood on top of the black pyramid. The pale light reflected the fine hairs on the girl's face. Next to her hand was a staff, a black metal staff about the thickness of an arm. It was inserted in the area opposite the base of the huge crystal, and a transparent crystal ball was placed on top of it. Brendel was certain that this thing did not exist in that place before. He patted Scarlet's hand. He and Orthless had already guessed the girl's problem. As long as the dragon's blood was not harmful, they could put it aside for the time being. The threat of the dragon girl Arnaz was still a little weak. He and the others walked over to take a look at the staff. The staff was black and there were golden patterns engraved on it. They looked like meaningless metal threads. The style of the staff was exactly the same as the hall. It had an ancient feel to it. The crystal ball was firmly attached to the staff, and it could not be removed no matter how hard he tried. Brando's strength was equivalent to 7 or 8 adults combined, and it did not budge even after he tried. This meant that the crystal ball and the staff were not connected by physical means. There might be magic at work below. Brando had a guess as soon as he saw it. He looked at the others and placed his hand on the crystal ball. In an instant, layers of green light weaved in front of him. These webs scanned up and down in an area of about a cubic meter in front of him, forming a mysterious pattern. So it's this thing. Brando's heart skipped a beat. What is it? Veronica asked. It's the core of this dungeon, Brando replied. Oh, so it's the core crystal. The Wind Elves' Ashen City Fortress also has a similar crystal. It was made by the Wizards of Buga, and it can be used to control the outer defense system. Valkyrie suddenly understood. Brando knew about the crystal in Ashen City Fortress, but it was just a replica of the core crystal. The craftsmen of Buga made many of these replicas, and they sold them to the players for 10,000 gold coins, about 1,000,000 tor, each. However, the replicas were far inferior to the real thing. A row of ancient characters intertwined in front of Brando and formed Staku, Doas, Roots, External Sanctum, Request, Interrupted, Damaged, Dumku, Doas, Roots, Dawn, Cavalry, Sanctum, Request, Interrupt, Possessase, Doas, Roots, Market, Requesting, Interrupt. The ancient language was extremely complex. These pictophonetic characters were extremely prosperous about 20,000 years ago. It seemed to have suddenly exploded at a certain time and spread throughout the entire continent. However, that era had long been buried under the sand, and Brando could only read these words with great difficulty. This was also due to the fact that he had seen too many ancient words before he transmigrated. The ancient characters in the Amber Sword were all self-contained, and they used to be called a miracle. Many players had done research on this. In the game, there were documents in the libraries of the larger empires. There was also a systematic archaeological investigation of ancient history and writing. Such a huge and complicated world background was something they used to talk about the most. However, as the characters became more and more complex, countless characters formed a green stream of light that fell like a waterfall in Brando's eyes. However, unlike before, everyone could now see the green light web intertwined on the crystal ball. Except for the symbols that they could hardly recognize, the light web quickly formed layers of patterns under Brando's instructions. This is the panoramic view of the underground city. When the layers of green light stabilized, Veronica's eyes flashed with a strange light. The image projected by the crystal was the panoramic view of the underground city. On top, they could see the 3 layers of defense that were distributed like broken glass, and then below, the city was distributed like a spider web. The underground halls of various sizes were 3-dimensional in mid-air, and it looked like a map of the galaxy. She couldn't help but turn around and look at Brando with her green eyes. This is the panoramic view of this city? Could it be that this central crystal can control the entire city? Brando took a deep breath and nodded. At this moment, he couldn't help but feel a little surprised and excited, but not because of what Veronica said. The ancient central crystal was the core and brain of the city, and as a player it was basic knowledge. He was surprised because of the knowledge he gained from the words. So this was the reason why Valhalla was called a legendary territory. After reading the ancient text information, although it was not complete and incomplete and he couldn't read all of it, Brando couldn't help but tremble with excitement. Valhalla was actually a concept territory. He didn't know how the ancient silver folk came up with the idea of building such a fortress. They actually set up a huge permanent magic system with the entire city as the foundation. A permanent magic system was different from a magic circle. This was a super complicated law, elements, and magic intertwined. In fact, it was a territory, a self-contained system within the space, and it was not affected by external forces. Unless the city was completely destroyed and turned into ashes, the system would continue to operate. This permanent magic system seemed to be a kind of spirit communication technique, but it was much higher level than that. The Valhalla people used a permanent transformation system to preserve their souls, gathering heroic spirits from all over the world into this fortress. It was used to preserve skills, technology, and soldiers that might have been lost in the river of time. In short, Valhalla was simply an ancient technology and information center. Brando saw the purgatory people who worshipped the sun and fire among these heroic spirits, as well as the mist elves and the legendary light folk. He saw the Dawn Spear Cavalry Temple, which was where the heroic spirits of the temple raised the purgatory people who worshipped the flames of the sun, the Dawn Spear Cavalry. The purgatory people were the legendary golden race. The Dawn Spear Cavalry could use the light of dawn to defend against enemies of darkness, and they had powerful healing spells, but this soldier class had already disappeared in the war between the purgatory people and the Twilight Dragon. Even the purgatory people themselves had disappeared in history. But he never thought that the Valhalla people would reappear in this martyr's temple. Although he didn't know how high the standard of the genuine Dawn Spear Cavalry was, the genuine Dawn Spear Cavalry was a level 10 soldier class. Even if it was a medium-sized empire, it could become the main force of the main forces. Other than that, he also saw the Twilight Altar that recruited Sudden Death Angels and the Eternal Dark Forest that recruited Dark Elf Archers. These two were legendary level 14 peak super armies. Even normal empires might not have them. Brando knew that other than those superpowers that spanned the continent, there were only the 4 empires established by the 4 sages that had this level of army. The ancient powerful warriors were all gathered here. This was the original intention of the Martyr's Temple. No one in the wound world knew the true meaning of the word Valhalla, but Brando's heart was clear. Legend said that Odin had his maid Valkyrie lead the heroic spirits to this great hall in the Glacier Forest, preparing for the dusk of the gods in the future. But just from the concept of raising soldiers, the Valhalla fortress in the wound world was indeed worthy of this name. But it was a pity, Veronica gasped at this time. It can control the central crystal of the entire city. Doesn't that mean that it can mobilize the magic power of the entire city? Is this a huge magic fortress? Brando of course knew what she was thinking. Such a fortress was almost equivalent to the floating city of the Bugas. That was the legacy of the Silver Folk. It was impossible that the people of Cruz would not be tempted. But he shook his head and replied, not the whole city but the whole territory. What? This time not only Veronica, but also Mephisto and Farina could not help but exclaim. What kind of concept was a magic territory? But Brando still shook his head. It's not that simple. What do you mean? Veronica was a little tempted. After all, she was a female general of the empire. If the loop of trade winds, which was originally just an enclave, was not enough to attract her, then a legendary magic territory was too tempting for her. You'll know when you come and see. Brando released the crystal in his hand and invited Veronica. His action stunned the lady slightly. She looked at him in surprise. You're asking me to come? Veronica looked at Brando curiously and confusedly. His action was equivalent to putting the entire defense system of the fortress under her control. Brando smiled and nodded. Veronica saw Brando's reaction and did not ask any more questions. She put her hand on the crystal ball, raised her eyebrows slightly and then lowered them again. Then a look of realization appeared on her face. What's wrong, Army Commander? Farina asked curiously. I see. I was wondering why you trusted me so much. Even though Veronica did not understand the ancient language, she could tell that the underground city had been severely damaged. Perhaps it was because of the erosion of time that the entire city was almost completely paralyzed. How badly was the city damaged? Is it possible to repair it? She asked. Brando shook his head. He had no intention of hiding the truth. The entire city was almost completely destroyed. Apart from the core of the city, the rest of the city is just an empty shell. There's no way to repair it. What a pity, Mephisto and Veronica said at the same time. Sly. Farina glared at him. It was indeed a pity. This was a legend in a magic territory. But Brando nodded. He was not sad at all. Because he already knew from the final text that this fortress was not the historical Valhalla, and the real Valhalla was still sleeping in this underground fortress. Because from the very beginning the Valhalla people had created 2 central crystals. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 473. After igniting the fire seed and confirming that the core crystal of the entire dungeon had completely lost its function, the group began to search the entire dungeon to see if there were any leftover benefits. The so-called adventure was to not return empty-handed. Moreover, ever since the fall of Erwin in the game, Brando had never been so comfortable going deep into the dungeon. In the past, when he teamed up with others, he would more or less be wary of his teammates behind his back. This was not something that had never happened before. The world of Wond was too big, and it was common for people to hide in any random country and disappear without a trace. Therefore, many people acted unscrupulously and made people fearful. However, exploring the dungeon with Veronica and Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles made Brando feel much more relaxed. Veronica was a woman of her words and had extremely high standards. She might not be interested in things that Brando was interested in, and she might not be able to recognize the things that she was interested in. Therefore, Brando was certain that this crew's goddess of war would be his. Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles was a guy who did not have any materialistic desires. Simply put, he was in fact a training maniac. If not for the burden of his country, he might have already reached Andesha's level. And now, he still needed Brando to help him restore his country, and it was even more impossible for him to do anything that was disadvantageous to Brando. In this way, Brando was equivalent to bringing two powerful bodyguards to explore. The underground ruins of the Silver Folk should have at least one or two silver legacies. Brando was full of confidence, but he did not expect that after wandering around the dungeon for a few hours, he did not find a single magical item. The mana in the entire Valhalla ruins seemed to have been decomposed, and even the magical items had lost their power at this moment. They had once passed through a corridor where a fierce battle had taken place. There were still a large number of ownerless and broken weapons and armors on the ground. At a glance, they could tell that these weapons and armors were once magical equipment. The mysterious runes and engravings on them were clearly visible, but they couldn't sense any trace of magic power. Almost the entire dungeon was like this. Brando even found some magical items that were used in daily life, such as illuminating crystals and magic-infused furnaces. Unfortunately, they had lost their magic and could not be used anymore. It was obvious that the city had been affected by some kind of powerful anti-magic spell. But what kind of magic could sweep through the entire city? It was as if there was a storm going on. Brando, Veronica, and Mephisto were a little surprised. In their knowledge, the largest war in prehistory took place at the end of the Dark Year thousands of years ago. It was the war between the four saints and the Darkness Dragon. However, the highest level of magic used in that war was only a 14th level forbidden spell. It was impossible for it to reach such a level. The war that had taken place in Valhalla should have at least surpassed the war before that era. In other words, these silver folk were most likely from the Age of Chaos. Their war was before ancient times, when the greatest enemy of civilization was the powerful monsters in the chaos. But although he could not get any magical items, Brando did not let go of the broken weapons and armors. He collected all of them with the dimensional hole. There was no iron or intangible, so these armors and weapons could still be used after being reheated. Especially the silver folk, the base materials for these equipment were quite high-end. Some were even forged with star-shaped gold. Brando could not help but secretly exclaim at the extravagance. Star-shaped gold was one of the materials with the best anti-magic effect among metals, and because it was an associated or with adamantine, its production was extremely low. Veronica was secretly amused when she saw him collecting all these junk. In her eyes, this young man always did things out of his own will. If it were any other nobles in front of her, they would not do such a thing so openly in front of her. Of course, the goddess of war of the empire did not think that Brando had nothing to do with nobles. Instead, it was Vahina who sneered at Brando for being a miser who had never seen money, but Brando accepted this evaluation. Tonajal and his new territory were just starting out, and everything was difficult at the beginning. When they needed money, he did not mind being stingy. Besides, even the whole of Erwin was just a corner of the border compared to the Cruz Empire. It was almost the same as Tonajal compared to the whole of Erwin, so his ABs could not be compared to the Empire. Brando understood this very well. You're so stupid. Brando's shamelessness angered the young lady of the Flower Leaf territory. She did not understand how Brando could see such a shameful thing, especially when she kindly reminded him but was ignored. Of course, this noble lady would never admit that she did so because she did not want Brando to embarrass himself in front of Veronica. They found many such battlefields in the ruins of Valhalla. The Silver Ancestors' defenders seemed to be resisting in every street, but in the end they were defeated and killed. Brando collected these weapons and armors every time he passed by, and in the end, There were at least tens of thousands of them piled up into a mountain in the dimensional cave. Fortunately, the size of the dimensional cave was only related to the strength of the creator. Amon's dimensional cave was almost as big as a cave. Brando estimated that the creator of this dimensional cave was at least a spellcaster above level 70. Not to mention the original items in the dimensional cave, just the dimensional cave itself was enough to make him rich. In that case, Amon, the captain of the transport company, could not rest in peace. Brando, Scarlet, Veronica, and Mephisto finally stopped after checking almost 2/3 of the underground city. They did not need to go any further. They were completely sure that Valhalla had been completely destroyed, and of course, there were no magical items left in it. After confirming this, Veronica and Mephisto lost interest in this place. This was especially true for the goddess of war herself. Not only did she fail to find any clues to the things she wanted, she even lost a few outstanding young people. Although this blow was not enough to shake her prestige in the Empire, it was more or less because of this reason that she had no intention of staying here any longer. She quickly expressed her intention to leave to Brando. The goddess of war did not even intend to return to the Green Tower. Apart from a few lucky ones who stayed in White Cliff, there were almost no survivors. Therefore, she planned to bring the remaining people back to the Empire through the Wolf's Pass. She did not want to deal with the Druids. Brando more or less understood Veronica's mentality. They had a conflict with the Druids in the Green Tower, and with Veronica's pride, she would not allow her potential enemies to see her in such a miserable state. However, Brando thought that the Druids might not be much better off now. Or rather, it should be said that none of the forces that stayed in this area were in a good state. The Crew's empire was considered to be in a better state compared to the other forces. At the very least, they still had some of their followers. But then again, before the war, Brando's forces from Tanajul could be said to be the weakest force. However, after the war, they were the ones that suffered the least losses. Even the youths who went out to train themselves did not suffer any losses. Although this was all thanks to his foresight, Veronica felt that it was a little too ironic. However, Brando did not intend to stay any longer. Right now, Valhalla could be said to be a dead city. It was meaningless to him, not to mention that he had already found a second central crystal in his previous exploration. This crystal was completely different from the previous one. It was gray and looked like a walnut. If it wasn't for the information he received from the first crystal, he wouldn't have been able to recognize it. If Brando could not recognize it, Veronica and the Ash Sword Saint would definitely not be able to recognize it. Just like that, he managed to obtain it without anyone noticing. However, after obtaining it, he realized that rebuilding Valhalla was not a simple matter. This crystal was the highest level of the city's central core. The first level of the crystal extended to a radius of 3 kilometers, and it could transfer mana to 20 buildings at the same time. It did not seem like much, but there were only so many buildings that needed to be transferred. Mage towers, magic circles, forges, lairs and so on. These buildings were not cheap to build. Even if it cost half of 20 buildings, Brando would not be able to build them in a short time. His current goal was to arrange for a Hydra lair and a magic forge. At most, he would add Amandina's magic laboratory in the future so that this quiet girl could research her mana transmission device in peace. Other than sympathy, Brando's original purpose of letting Amandina join him was for this future treasure. Although Amandina volunteered to be his assistant, and she was indeed outstanding, she had not discovered her true value. Brando did not want to bury such a genius. However, these were all things that would happen in the future. After Brando obtained the central crystal, he found out that the core of Valhalla was a central hall called the World Tree Temple. First, he had to build this hall and activate the central crystal in his hand. Only then would the core of his territory be able to spread out in all directions. However, this so-called World Tree Temple was built by planting the central crystal, just like planting a tree. The entire process would take nearly 2 weeks. Although Brando did not understand why such a strange method was used to build the temple, he could not stay in this damn place for 2 weeks. Ever since he entered the central region of the Loop of Trade Winds, he had completely lost contact with the outside world. Although it had not even been a day, his territory was surrounded by powerful enemies and could be in danger at any time. He had to straighten out everything here as soon as possible, and then return with the benefits of this adventure to deal with any enemies that might come. As for the matter of rebuilding the World Tree Temple, he could leave it to Amandina after leaving this place, and then ask the Druids for help. There should not be any problems. Because of this, when Veronica expressed her intention to leave, Brando simply expressed his willingness to leave with her. Veronica was a little surprised by this, but she was happy to see it. She admired Brando and did not mind showing this admiration. After Brando chose to leave, Mephisto naturally had no reason to stay. He had originally come to find trouble with Veronica alone, but he did not expect to form a temporary alliance with Veronica and Brando. But now, this temporary alliance was about to take root and grow at the edge of Erewhon's wilderness. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 474. When he walked out of the loop of trade winds, he paused for a moment. What's wrong? Veronica turned around and asked. It's nothing. Brando shook his head. The moment he walked out of the wind wall, he felt a connection with his summoned creature. Medisha and the Shire immediately reported to him what was happening in his territory. In less than a day, Count Randner had already made his move. The harsh winter in Erewhon was not yet over, and it was much earlier than Brando had expected. He asked Medisha to praise the little Roman in their telepathic communication, but he was not too surprised by the news. The entire Abes had been preparing for this war for months, and they were waiting for this day. Besides, it would be too fake if they could not survive the first few weeks of the war. He then gave a few more instructions to Seal and asked the young mage to continue supervising the druids in his territory to reinforce the defensive line along the river. He also asked Seal to keep him updated on the situation once the battle started. Brando suddenly realized that the Planeswalker's telepathic communication ability was really overpowered. It could even give him the ability to command the battlefield from afar. Although there were other magical items that could achieve the same effect, in a low-intensity war like the one in Erewhon, neither side could afford to pay such a price. But then he immediately sensed a weak telepathic call that should not exist. Mephistopheles? Brando stared in disbelief at the cute girl, who appeared in front of him. She was covered in blood and her black dress was torn to shreds. Even her shoulders were exposed. Mephistopheles was lying in a pile of rubble, seemingly unconscious. She seemed to have climbed up from the bottom of the canyon. Perhaps she thought that Brando was still at the top, but she lost consciousness due to exhaustion. Mephistopheles seemed to have sensed Brando's call. Perhaps it was because of the special connection between a planeswalker and a planeswalker, but in the next moment she suddenly blinked and woke up. The young girl's gentle face revealed a dreamy expression. Although her fair face was covered in blood, she still glowed with radiance. Master, you finally found me. I've been looking for you for a long time. Brando finally understood that the Mephistopheles did not enter the graveyard after Andesha knocked them out of the canyon. They had lost contact with each other when they entered the fog below. It was not strange when he thought about it. Mephistopheles had been strengthened many times at that time, and their strength was close to Veronica's. How could they die so easily? Perhaps it was because the cards had been reset every day, and their strength had returned to normal. That was why they fainted halfway through the climb. Brando could not help but breathe a sigh of relief when he saw that the vampire was still around. Mephistopheles were gold-tier creatures, and they could reach elemental strength through sacrifice. With her around, it was equivalent to having a powerful ally. However, Brando still could not treat his summons as cards. He could not help but ask guiltily when he saw the girl in such a state. Are you all right? I'm fine, Mephistopheles shook her head, but her face was a little red. I'm just a little hungry, master. Under Scarlet's blushing face and Vahina's strange gaze, 2 sweet teeth marks appeared on Brando's neck. Wait, didn't you say you can't bite my neck? No matter how much Mephistopheles looked like a woman, Brando could not accept being bitten by a man on the neck. But he did not expect the Mephistopheles to be so fast. Even he could not react in time. Vampires were known for their speed. Back then, Andesha's strength was 2 ranks higher than Brendel's, and Brando's current strength was only at the upper middle of gold tier. Mephistopheles revealed 2 cute little fangs and answered shyly with a blushing face. Because Mephistopheles is heavily injured, so I need Master's blood. And Master's blood is delicious. Brando could only look at the heavens speechlessly. Moreover, Mephistopheles was indeed injured because of him. Therefore he could only strictly order this transvestite vampire not to approach his neck unless he had permission to do so. The small interlude soon calmed down. No matter what, Brando was willing to see his side become stronger in order to deal with the challenges from the north. A day later, the group finally left the canyon and returned to the Pass of Wolves. The terrifying scene from before was no longer visible in the Pass of Wolves. After the flame seed was ignited, order was slowly being restored outside the loop of trade winds. At this moment, the dark forest welcomed its first morning after many days. The forest was quiet, and there were still sparkling dewdrops hanging from the leaves. But everything seemed peaceful. Regardless of whether it was the crew's Erwin or the remaining tree elves and centaurs, all of them came out from under the white stone. Brando, Veronica, and the others had not returned for a few days. Their return caused quite a commotion in the temporary camp. The first person Brando saw was Amandina running over in a hurry, followed by Falerne and her younger sister. Tia had been revived during the reset, but the others did not know about it. They only thought that she had lost her way and found her way back. "My lord." Amandina was wearing a leather robe. She stood in front of Brando and exhaled a white breath. No matter how calm she appeared on the surface, she could not hide the relief and joy in her eyes. "I'm back." Brando did not miss Amandina's tired expression, but to this girl he trusted the most, his answer was only a slight nod. That was enough. He and Amandina were actually very similar people. Their minds were clear and they could understand each other's thoughts. As the best of partners, they did not need to speak much to understand each other's thoughts. This was the unreserved trust between them. Even if the Emperor of the Cruz Empire valued her talent and personally came to hire her, she would not be willing to leave this place. She believed that other than Brando, no one else could give her this kind of trust and understanding. Amandina began to believe that this kind of trust was beyond the hazy love between a man and a woman. It was purely a kind of mutual need and dependence on each other. Brando did not ask any more questions. He raised his head and looked at the white stone. The arrogant second son of Lord Maxon, Carglaise, smiled and bowed his head in greeting. It was almost like the etiquette of a retainer. This young man, who was supposed to stand on the side of the nobles, had chosen to fight for another cause. In the past few months of battles, including the performance during the Wolf Tide, he had won the basic trust of Brando. With this foundation of trust, he had everything. Behind Carglaise were the youths from Erwin. They were still immature and there were even some nobles among them. After the calamity of wolves, these youths seemed to have found their own direction in the turbulent turbulence of history. They were reborn and their expressions showed maturity and determination. "My lord." When the youths saw Brando and the others walking out of the forest, they quieted down. The story of the past few days was like a legend that they had personally experienced. Brando alone entered the loop of trade winds and ignited the flame seed at the most critical moment. They saw with their own eyes the moment the calamity of wolves was completely eliminated. Such a magnificent scene made everyone feel as if they could hear the loud bang of history and the future. Just a day ago, the Druids of the Green Tower had also sent people to express their gratitude. After the Druids, the mercenaries and the survivors of other forces, apart from the envoys of other countries, more or less came to express their gratitude. Not to the Kurlutz people but to the Green Tower. This confirmed the guesses of the youths. On that night, when the pillars of light that represented order disappeared in the violent storm, only one person lit up the lighthouse of this world. This time, Erwin was the main character. Even the Cruz Empire had to step aside. Of course, Brando didn't know that his actions had won him many potential friends. The survivors of the calamity of wolves were more or less indebted to him. One couldn't imagine the gratitude one would feel when a stranger saved one's life in a desperate situation. When the calamity of wolves was at its most violent, everyone thought that the darkness had completely suppressed the light. Even the last trace of order had disappeared. The Green Tower's light was about to be extinguished. But when a ray of light flashed from the bottom of their eyes and completely dispelled the darkness, everyone had the same question in their hearts. What was that? But when they learned of Brendel's plan from the Druids, the shock in their hearts was indescribable. Of course, this sudden shock and gratitude might only be temporary. But in any case, when Brando interacted with these people in the future, this moment of gratitude would earn him a lot of points. This was a huge gain for him. But Brando didn't know this at the moment. He only felt that these youths were unbelievably quiet when they saw him. He had a high prestige among these youths before, but that was the prestige of a lord. But at this moment they looked at him as if he was their king. If one day they became knights, they would answer to Brando's call and fight for a heroic king. This was the dream of countless young knights. After the four sages, there was only one such king in the past, and that was Erwin's predecessor, King Eric. But he had passed away, and Wond had been calling for heroes for 100 years. Looking at these youths, Brando was satisfied. The embryonic form of the White Lion Legion had appeared. He took a step forward and placed his right hand on the hilt of Haurangaya. The calamity of wolves is over, but your true enemy is right before your eyes. Now follow me and prepare to return to the Green Tower. Long live Erwin. Long live Erwin. Everyone was in an uproar. P.S. I'm sorry but I forgot to delete the draft when I was writing. I only discovered it after a book friend reminded me. But there are still more than 3,200 words left. But Chidian can only edit more not less. Damn it, it's really troublesome. Let's take up more words at the end. I'll post the attributes of Heaven's Chosen here. The readers in the group have been asking about it. Heaven's Chosen is a Halo-type talent. The first attribute is to increase the morale and defense of the troops under your command. You must be a direct subordinate. There is no limit to the number of races under your command, and your territory's honor will increase faster. Territory's honor is a special resource of the Lord system. It can be used to increase the power of items like the core crystal. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to vote for it on Chidian.com. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 475. The situation of the Druids surprised Brendel quite a bit. There were more than 1,000 survivors in the Green Tower, and the number of Druid apprentices and tree elves that came to the Loop of Trade Winds was more than a quarter of the total population of the Loop of Trade Winds. This was a lot better than the calamity of wolves that happened in history, where most of the Druids were killed. Brando had thought that the Druids would have to pay a heavy price for rewinding history by himself, but it seemed that he had done a better job than expected. The thousands of players in history might not have been of much use, but the two great adepts of the Silver Alliance, William and Tullman, had been the stabilizing force of the situation. The Druids welcomed them back from the Loop of Trade Winds with the highest ceremony. Even though there were many things that needed to be done in the city, hundreds of high-grade Druids still drew out their precious mana from the pool of nature to lay down a path of flowers for Brando from the Wall of Roses. The day they arrived at the Green Tower, the entire city had turned out in full force. The young nobles were excited because Brando had joked that there might be elven beauties who would give them a kiss. Of course, the scene they had imagined did not happen. The elven girls were still reserved and cautious. They hid in the forest and looked at the heroes of other races with curiosity. There were no kisses, but at least everyone received a wreath from the elven girls. Brando even received two, but he did not have time to see the faces of the two elven girls who gave him the wreaths. The one who led the Druid elders to welcome them was Quinn. The leader of the tree elves walked up to Brendel and opened his arms to hug the youth. He gently patted the youth's shoulders. This was the highest form of respect a hunter could give to a comrade. It was obvious that the leader of the tree elves had acknowledged the honor of fighting alongside Brendel. To the elves, this was a friendship of life and death. Quinn took a step back and spoke in the language of the tree elves, Aten Mistaler. The forest is evergreen with you, my friend. Ateros Dar X, Dorman. The forest is evergreen and the bowstring is humming. Brendel replied calmly in the tree elven language. A trace of surprise flashed across Quinn's face. The tree elves' language, which was developed from the wood tribe's language, was completely different from the wind elves' language. He didn't expect Brando to understand the meaning of his words, but he didn't expect that not only did he understand, but his reply was also completely in line with the tree elves' etiquette. The Druid elders behind Quinn were also surprised. It was unthinkable for a human to know so much about their habits and habits. Of course, they didn't know that Brando was different from ordinary people. He had lived in many places and understood many cultures and customs that ordinary people didn't know. At this moment, Quinn revealed a kind smile and said, "You didn't disappoint us and we won't go against our oath. You are now the lord of this land." He raised both his hands and revealed a white acorn in his palms. Brando was shocked when he saw the white acorn. "This is the fruit of the white sacred oak? You're giving this to me?" In the tree elves' traditions, they worshipped the white sacred oak, which was the guardian of all souls in the forest. There was a white sacred oak in the Green Tower where the fire seed was stored. It was the spiritual home of all elves and druids. Quinn gave him the fruit of the white sacred oak, which meant that he regarded him as his lord. Generally speaking, only the Grand Druid Elder had the right to hold the fruit of the white sacred oak. "You should be familiar with our traditions, right, Brando?" Quinn held the fruit with both hands and said to Brando. Brando nodded and looked at the smiling Quinn and the druids behind him in surprise. Could it be that they were bowing down to him because he had saved this place? That was a little too ridiculous. Quinn seemed to have seen through Brando's doubts and explained, "According to tradition, we and the druids would follow our traditions and gradually move out of the civilized areas to guard the new Black Forest. However, my lord, we've carefully considered your proposal. If you're willing to open up the wilderness and follow the path of the ancient sages, we're willing to submit to you." "You're also thinking of recuperating, right?" Brando asked. Quinn had a look of appreciation on his face. As tree elves, they rarely beat around the bush during negotiations. Brendel was clearly aware of their habits and was willing to do as the Romans did. Quinn nodded. Yes, we and the Druids will need a few years to recuperate. During this time, we'll be able to witness you fulfill your promise. I'm afraid a few years won't be enough. But if you just want to see if I'm a man of my word, I don't mind. Brando nodded and secretly rejoiced. Things had gone much smoother than he had expected. He had told the Druids about his long-term plans so that he could keep the tree elves, Druids, and centaurs. Of course, the Green Tower had suffered heavy losses. Although their population was better than before, most of them were elderly, children, and women. The warriors had suffered heavy losses during the calamity of wolves. Even if they joined him, they wouldn't be able to provide much help in the upcoming war. At most, they would be a long-term investment. However, Brando didn't make a decision immediately after receiving the oak fruit. He pondered for a moment before saying, "But I think it's best if we remain allies. This is my territory, but it's also your home. We have a common goal, so there's no need for formalities." What? Quinn didn't expect Brando to decline. He could see that this young man's goal was this land. "I need a wholehearted ally, not a subordinate who feels restrained," Brando replied. He knew that the tree elves and druids wouldn't be used to living like humans. Since that was the case, he might as well be generous. After all, the druids and tree elves would definitely join his army to protect their homeland. Quinn gave him a serious look and turned to look at the other druid elders. Everyone had a satisfied look on their faces. "You're the most unique human I've ever met. Brando, can we be friends?" Quinn asked. Brendel nodded. Friends needed time to grow, and he understood what the tree elf meant. "Then, my friend, may I invite you to our celebration?" Quinn asked with a smile. However, Brando shook his head and said, "I'm afraid not. Quinn, I need your help." "Help?" "Yes. I'm going to leave this place and return to my territory. However, I need a batch of supplies, armor, and weapons. Also, I need a group of Pegasi that can quickly send us out of the dark forest." Brando replied. As soon as he said this, the surroundings immediately quieted down. Carglass and Coden finally understood why Brando was in such a hurry to bring everyone back to the Green Tower. It seemed like something had happened in the territory. Quinn pondered for a moment. "Are you in trouble, human friend?" "Yes. My territory is under threat. I need to solve this problem before I can return to fulfill my promise with you." "Is it a war?" Brando nodded. The tall tree elf leader had a look of understanding in his eyes. He straightened his body and turned around to face his people in the forest. "Did you hear that? Our human ally needs an army that can fight. He once went into a dangerous place alone and saved everyone here from the darkest of situations. Now, my fellow tree elves, are you the kind of people who cherish your own lives?" Quinn's voice reverberated throughout the forest. Brando was stunned. He knew the current situation of the druids and knew that it was impossible for them to continue participating in the war. However, what the tree elf leader was doing now was to gather an army. "Quinn, I want to fight by your side, human friend." Quinn smiled at him. "You're right. This is your territory and our home. Without bloodshed and battle, how can we protect this precious treasure?" There was no passionate reply. Instead, the elves with longbows walked out of the forest one after another. Most of them were women because most of the adult males had perished in the calamity of wolves. Then came the centaurs. Of course, the centaurs would not back down in the pursuit of glory. The druids also responded to the call. They were a group of people who did not care about the outside world, but that did not mean that they were indifferent to the outside world. Just like what they had promised, the war to protect was meaningful to them. Even so, the army that had gathered outside the forest only had a few hundred people. The druids had suffered heavy losses in the calamity of wolves, and this was something that could not be helped. However, to everyone's surprise, before the elves could stand still, another group of elves walked out of the forest. They were mercenaries and adventurers. These humans were wearing a variety of armor and looked like an army of beggars, but they all stood out. After these people walked out, the forest became silent again. Soon, a man was elected from the group. "My lord, thanks to your grace, we were able to survive this calamity. Now, I heard that you need an army." The bearded, sloppy man blinked his eyes, spread his hands and asked lazily, "Then, if I may be so bold as to ask, do you need an army that is born for war and is willing to accept your employment?" Brando suddenly felt a little speechless. "What price can you offer?" he asked in a deep voice as if he was really negotiating a price. "How about a gold coin?" the man asked. Brando looked at him. "Good, now you are my knight. 1 gold coin and I promise to bring you to witness my victory," he replied. Without any unnecessary words, the mercenaries pulled out their swords and raised them high. A forest of swords. Then the elves knocked their longbows. Brando suddenly felt a strange feeling in his heart. Humans and elves stood together again after thousands of years. The sacred oath of the past seemed to be replayed at this moment. No one would forget today's oath of alliance. Everyone who witnessed this moment would remember it for the rest of their lives. The young people behind him also pulled out their swords. This scene was too shocking. Even Coden and Mephisto, who did not have a clear sense of belonging, could not help but lose their ability to speak. This alliance did not seem strong, but in the end, it seemed to have a magical power that could change everything. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Jianghu to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 476. The combined forces of the humans and elves numbered close to 1,000. However, the adventurers and mercenaries who dared to venture into the dark forest were all elites. Most of them were at the pinnacle of the iron rank and some were even at the silver rank. The tree elves were about the same. Those who were able to survive the calamity of wolves were at least at the silver rank. An army of nearly 1,000 silver-ranked and iron-ranked soldiers that were equivalent to Aween's knights and sergeants. Even the best army in Aween did not have such a luxurious lineup. Imagine the expression on Count Randner's face if such an army suddenly appeared on the battlefield that he did not expect. The druids were working day and night to prepare the equipment for the army. There were great druids guarding the nature's pool in the Green Tower at all times. They used magic to create ironwood armor. Even though it was not as hard as real steel, it was much lighter and lighter. The centaur's smithy was lit up throughout the night, and the clanking of metal could be heard from miles away. Swords, spears, and halberds were constantly being produced and delivered to the hands of the centaur's smiths. The other factions that were still in the Green Tower also sent their own smiths over. The mountain dwarves even volunteered to join the centaur's smiths in the smithy to guide them in their work. Therefore you could often see such a spectacle. A few dwarves, centaurs, and elves would stand together and argue with each other. Such a scene could only be seen in the era of the War of the Holy Saints. However, Brando knew that these factions either did not have any conflict of interest with Erwin, or did not even have any border with Erwin. This was why their envoys could express their gratitude to him. Even the coldest faction supported Brando verbally. If Brando were to return to the Empire, they would support him in the Holy Cathedral. This was a colleague from the Holy Cathedral of Fire. On the other hand, the Wind Elves claimed that they did not need to send reinforcements directly. The elegant elven envoy even joked that the Wind Elves had a precious friendship with their late king Eric. But this was not a joke. Saint Tassol and Cruz had clashed with each other every year. The Saint Tassol people were only worried that they would not be able to seize the opportunity to send reinforcements. They were not worried that their neighbors would fly into a rage. These evil elves could not wait for His Majesty to die from anger. Even so, Brando still declined the other party's good intentions. After all, if the Saint Tassol were to intervene, it would become a war between the Holy Cathedral of Fire and the Holy Cathedral of Wind. Brando didn't want to start a holy war, and he didn't want to stand against the entire Holy Cathedral of Fire. In this regard, Orthlis had the same opinion. Although Orthlis was a wind elf at this moment, she was on Brando's side. Naturally, she had to consider the issue from the standpoint of Erwin's people. Her foresight had been experienced for thousands of years, and her wisdom in politics could only be better than Brando's. In the next few days, Brando met with an unexpected guest, Count Audine. It turned out that Erwin's envoy was not completely wiped out that day. Count Audine, Dolent, and a few other small nobles were saved by Anderson, who was passing by. At this moment, Brando's prejudice against Erwin's envoy was completely gone. From the moment Audine led the others to return and fight side by side with the centaur elder Widd, he thought that at least the descendants of the late king could pick up the long-lost flag from the battlefield. Then, the will of the Lionheart sword could also be inherited. Even so, the purpose of Audine's visit still surprised Brando. The Count looked at him deeply before telling him that they would consider persuading Her Highness to stand on his side. This was the first time Brando received kindness from a high-ranking noble in the kingdom. This was extremely important to him because his ultimate wish was not to stand against Her Highness. However, the change in Audine's attitude still surprised him. He knew that the internal strife of the nobles in the Erwin kingdom would definitely not change just because he saved their lives. Odin was a soldier before he was a noble, and Brendel trusted his character. Brendel knew that Odin was a soldier first and he was a nobleman after that. But Audine's answer was simple. After that day's charge, Everyone who went through life and death with him had the same realization. It was as if the flag of the late king was once again flying on the battlefield, but the flag of Erewhon had not shone for too long. After that day's battle, almost all of the people of Erewhon who went along with him cried. It was not because of the fear of surviving but because of regret. They were ashamed of their ancestors, and they were regretful of the lost glory. It had been many years since Audine had such a hot-blooded pursuit. He did not know who would be able to pick up King Eric's white flag. He used to place his hopes on the royal family of Corvado, but that day he saw something different in Brando and the people who fought side by side with him. It was the kind of temperament that Buga and the cunning fox had seen once in the south. It was the kind of oath that seemed to be engraved on the Lionheart sword. It was the belief that belonged to Erewhon. I only ask that you promise to always stand on the side of Erewhon, on the side of King Eric and his descendants. After saying this, Audine and Count Dolent left. Brando nodded. He had won the first promise from a noble in Erewhon. This promise tied him to the same war chariot in history. Now everything was back to square one. The preparations for the war between the humans and the elves continued day after day. Brando originally planned to finish all the work in half a month, but the news from his territory had confirmed that Madara was involved. There were also many pieces of evidence that pointed to the commander of the skeletons being Insursta's right-hand man, Tarkus the One-Eyed Dragon. This was definitely bad news. Madara was like a sharp sword hanging over Brando's head. He had no choice but to bring forward the date by a week. After a week, the army had to move out. Of course, Brando did not slack off during this week. His priority was to increase his strength, and the best way to do so was to extract the EXP from the Book of Mavacart. That thing was like a treasure trove to him. When he was in the center of the loop of trade winds, he had only extracted a small amount of EXP, and he had already received around 30,000 EXP. Leveling up from a level 27 mercenary to a level 28 one only required around 130,000 EXP. Of course, Brando did not dare to show this ability to Veronica when she was around. Even though the Cruz Empire's goddess of war was very fond of him, the Cruz Empire was still a potential enemy. Moreover, it was easy to be suspicious of someone who was growing stronger with every passing second. After Veronica left, Brando was in a hurry to return to the Green Tower. He did not have time to deal with the Amon's Book of Inheritance. It wasn't until the Elven and human allied armies were formed, and the Druid cities began to operate at full capacity that he finally had the time to spare. Brando asked Quinn to prepare a quiet room for him. He then took out the Book of Mavacart and began to touch it. Even though he was mentally prepared, the 130,000 EXP required for leveling up from level 27 to level 28 came to an end in just 2 minutes. When the system notification sounded, Brando was shocked by the speed of leveling up. It was faster than sitting on a rocket. It was so strange that it felt unreal. Brando suppressed the excitement and shock in his heart. The feeling of seeing his EXP bar skyrocket was too good. He almost wanted to stand up and dance for joy. After going through so much, he still had a basic level of calmness. He took a deep breath and continued to guide the energy into his own laws. 5 minutes later, 170,000 EXP was obtained. His mercenary level was now level 29. 10 minutes later, 220,000 EXP was obtained. His mercenary level was now level 30. Leveling up 3 times in half an hour was unrealistic. Brando looked at the ball of black light in his hand. Even after losing 500,000 EXP, it did not seem to have decreased. This meant that the power of the Book of Mavacart was greater than he had imagined. Brando couldn't help but tremble a little. After reaching level 30, he was not in a hurry to continue leveling up. Instead, he went to the Centaur settlement and looked for a warrior grandmaster to discuss some problems regarding combat skills. Of course, he was not there to chat. Instead, he was there because once a class reached level 30, it would be able to learn a core skill related to that class. Skills exclusive to a class could be trained to master rank, but core skills required a certain level of attainment in that class. This level of attainment was usually at level 30, 40, and 60. After level 60, it was a completely different concept. Brando did not want to think about the chain quests related to Element Quest and Perfect Body for the time being. Brando had been to the Green Tower before, so he was quite familiar with the place after the Calamity of Wolves. Sure enough, he found the master warrior called Mainhoof in the Centaur district. Mainhoof looked no different from an ordinary centaur, but in reality half of his blood flowed from the scorching river. He wasn't particularly outstanding among the master warrior NPCs in Wond, but Brando knew that there were 2 very powerful battle techniques taught by him. The first was called Piercing Strike. It was one of the most powerful low-level warrior skills, even surpassing some of the mid-level skills. It also had a chance to deal double critical damage. It was one of the early core skills of a warrior. The second skill was even stranger. It could only be used once and would not be added to the list of skills. This skill was called Bloodline Awakening. It was one of the innate abilities of a demon. Simply put, this ability reset the experience points of a player's skills. In fact, this was the only chance for players to reset their experience points before they could obtain the meditation incense. P.S. Someone asked about the Alpha Wolf Ekis. Of course, Ekis is still alive. It's not that easy to wake up from the demigod's slumber. Alpha Wolf Ekis is the final boss of the Calamity of Wolves, worldwide, quest in the past. It will be mentioned later. Someone also asked about the issue of re-updating. Actually, re-updating is inevitable. It's just a bottleneck for me. I'll talk to you about the specifics when I have time. Anyway, I think I've figured it out. You can call it a breakthrough. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 477. Regardless of whether it was Bloodline Awakening or Piercing, there was a long chain of quests, but Brendel had an advantage. His reputation in the Green Tower was almost full, and Maine did not dare to refuse his request. He was even honored to teach him the skills. After obtaining Bloodline Resurgence, Brando removed all the skills from the Militia class and placed the Silver Elf skill, In-Depth Analysis, under the Mercenary class. The special riding skill Dragon Hunt was only a temporary skill, so it was only natural for him to remove it. Power Burst and Piercing Strike could not be used at the same time, and Frontal Assault was also eliminated for the same reason. The White Raven Sword art was a bit of a pity, but this skill had already reached a bottleneck. It would be very difficult for him to progress further without the inheritance. Moreover, he was about to learn the 9 Luminary Sword art, so after some hesitation, Brando removed the skill that had been with him since the beginning. The White Raven Sword art was originally a modified version of the Wind Elves' Inheritance of the Stars. Even though Orthless herself was a Moon Inheritor, the legendary sword art would only be stronger, not weaker. After removing the main skills from the Mercenary class, Brando received nearly 6,000 EXP. He spent half of it to upgrade Piercing Strike to Master, level 10. Now, Piercing Strike dealt 425% damage in a 30-meter cone with a 12.7% chance to deal a critical hit. Master Attribute, double the damage dealt during charge. Even though the attack range was much worse than the White Raven Sword art, it was nothing compared to the damage dealt. With the Master Attribute, if he was lucky, he could deal 15 times the damage. Even though the chance was not much higher than winning the lottery, it was still much rarer than winning the lottery. The reason why he chose to reset his stats now was because he had his own considerations. Before entering the loop of trade winds, his first consideration was how to solve his current predicament. However, after gaining the trust of the Druids of Valhalla and the Green Tower, he believed that he had the ability to control his own destiny. To the players, they were originally bystanders. It could be said that they were born with this ability. But for the natives of this world, they had to put in a lot of effort to get to this point. And once he had this ability, it meant that he could design his own learning and growth path in the long run, just like the players. The goal of a player was to become the strongest. His goal was to shake an era with his own strength. In gaming terms, this meant that he had to play the role of carry. In the later stages of the game, he had to be a godly existence that could save the world. Of course, it was not that extreme, but it meant that he had to spend a lot of resources and carefully plan growth. Carry refers to the hero that is the core of the strategy in Dota games. This type of hero can even change the entire situation of the game in the later stages of the game, turning the tables and leading the entire team to victory. Brendel used it to refer to the fact that he needed this ability. The reason why Brando stopped the mercenaries at level 30 and the elementalists at level 25 was because these two levels represented an advancement. Frost Blade, Frigid Knight, was a class that could control both the ice element and the warrior battle skills. He happened to know a fantasy weapon that was suitable for this class, Avelio's Golden Flame Ice. This sword belonged to the daughter of the future Yura, Erwin's last legitimate bloodline, Princess Alala Ophelia. However, for the sake of the current Erwin, Brando felt that he could only let this unborn girl suffer a little. With his understanding of the Amber Sword, he had already planned this path during the battle that night. At that time he had not obtained Haurangaya yet. The Frigid Knight was a dual-wielding warrior. The main weapon was Haurangaya, and the secondary weapon was Golden Flame Ice. In the future he could also advance into the Frost Earth Guard, which was related to the ice and earth elements. It was the best combination. To advance into a frigid night, he needed to go to the ice elemental plane's eternal frozen glacier. Interplanar travel required a total character level of at least 80. In this regard, Brando planned to be a level 10 Temple Knight. After obtaining Conflict Aura, the Temple Knight could advance into a temple in Ampere Seal, which was only a month or two away. As for before that, although he could not level up, Brando had things to do. From reaching level 30 to learning Piercing Strike, Brando only took half a day. After that, he went back to the quiet room to wake up Orthless and prepare to learn 9 Luminary Sword Art. This was his first trump card in this world. It could be regarded as a core ability in his character growth plan. Of course he had to master it first. However, as soon as the Elven Knight taught him the skill, Brando was dumbfounded. The 9 Luminary Sword Art's properties were as follows. When attacking, an illusion would be created at the position before the user moved to attack the enemy. At most, the illusion would have 5% of the user's attack power. The illusion could use skills, but it would need to draw mana from the user. Wind Empress's Inheritance of the Moon wasn't like Gretel's Flash Strike Sword Art, which relied on speed to achieve multiple attacks. This was a magic sword art. Thinking about it, the so-called Inheritance of the Moon was naturally most closely related to the moon's magic power. However, this was not the reason why he was dumbfounded. It was the cost of learning this sword art, 3550 EXP, and that was only the EXP required to learn this sword art. Brando immediately wanted to kneel down. Military sword art only required a few EXP to level up from level 1 to level 2, but after reaching level 13, it would still require tens of thousands of EXP to level up. According to this ratio, wouldn't the 9 Luminary Sword Arts EXP after level 10 be like a bottomless pit? Seeing Brando's slightly darkened face, Orthless thought that there was a problem and could not help but ask, "What's wrong?" Brando shook his head. "It's too difficult." The Elven Knight was stunned for a moment, then she couldn't help but chuckle in his mind. Orthless had a smug look on her face. "So there are times when you find things difficult, little brother? I thought you knew how to do everything." She glanced at Brando and teased, "Ha, did you know that when I learned this sword art, I reached the beginner level before the age of 35? I was called one of the most talented inheritors of this sword art. How about it, don't let me down?" Elves matured much slower than humans. A 35-year-old was equivalent to a 5 or 6-year-old human. Looking at the amount of EXP required, Brando knew how difficult this sword art was. To reach the beginner level at the age of 5 or 6, one could indeed be considered a genius. The so-called beginner level meant that one had to master the first 3 levels. This was not a problem for Brando. He glanced at Orthless. How could he let this big sister look down on him? After thinking for a while, he decided to put the rest of his EXP into this skill. Then he took a step forward, leaving behind an afterimage that looked exactly like him. You. Brando, how is this possible?" Orthless held her breath, her green eyes widening in disbelief. Even her mature and calm appearance looked a little cute. This was simply too inconceivable. Even with her nearly 1,000 years of experience, she couldn't help but be shocked to the extreme. If she could, Orthless would definitely shout, "Cheat," in her heart. This guy is cheating. However, Orthless did not know about the existence of this so-called cheat. In just a moment, Brando had grasped the essence and usage of the strongest and most core sword art in the Moon Inheritance. It was an ancient sword art that was even more powerful than a series of high-level sword arts. It was known as a cheat skill. Even in the era of the War of the Holy Saints, no one dared to say that they could create such a sword art. Flash Strike Sword Art, 9 Luminary Sword Art, and Cry of the Earth and Mountains were all such inheritances. Could it be that there really is such a genius in this world? Could it be that the legends of the divine people in history are true? Orthless looked at Brando, her heart shaking like thunder. Who is this little guy? How could such an existence be born in this era? However, Brando did not notice Orthless's shock, because he was also shocked by the power of the 9 Luminary Sword Art. Brando took a step forward, and the afterimage behind him seemed to have inherited all of his knowledge and sword art inheritance. It immediately took a step forward and corresponded with his position. If there were enemies around him at this time, the afterimage would be in a position to attack. Even if it was Brando himself, it would not be so. The afterimage only existed for a few tenths of a second before it disappeared. Since there were no enemies, it did not draw its sword. Although it was only a short time, it was more than enough for a battle where victory and defeat were often decided by a single line. Godly skill. What kind of skill could increase a person's combat strength by several times, and even give a person the ability to deal with multiple enemies at once? Even a high-level sword art would not be able to do such a thing. Brando looked at the 9 luminary sword arts label, extraordinary ancient, shining like gold. In the next few days, Brando was completely immersed in the world of sword art. If he was as addicted to the game as he was back then, he had never even heard of such a powerful skill, let alone seen it in the game. After obtaining such a sword art, the first thing he needed to do was to raise it to the highest level possible. Although he did not have enough sword art EXP, it was not a problem. After all, he still had the remains of the Book of Mavakart. Without sword art EXP, he would convert it to normal EXP. He could still accept a 10:1 ratio, and so he spent the next week absorbing the power of the Book of Mavakart, hammering the sword art, absorbing it, and hammering it again. Other than daily activities, no one saw Brando come out of the silent room. Of course, his sword art had also improved by leaps and bounds. Brando tested his maximum absorption speed, and found that it was about 700,000 EXP per hour. However, the Book of Mavakart was a self-contained system, and even after it was broken, the natural law would still resist Brando's absorption. Due to the lack of consciousness, the resistance would gradually increase. Brando found that he could only absorb 2 to 3 million express per day, and then it would be difficult to continue. Since he did not need to level up, all of the EXP was converted into skill EXP. At first, his 9 luminary sword art was leveling up at a rate of 2 levels per day, to the point that Orthless was a little numb to it. This elven knight who had been through countless battles wondered if she was still in a dream. But on the third day, when the 9 luminary sword art reached level 5, Brando found that the situation had changed. 9 luminary sword art, expert, extraordinary/ancient when attacking, create an illusion at the position before moving to attack the enemy. A maximum of 5 illusion clones can be created. The illusion clones have 35% of the original user's attack power. The clones can use skills, but they need to draw mana from the original user. Expert effect. When the illusion clones are created, the original user can choose to swap positions with the illusion clones once. There's a special effect at the expert level? Brendel was dumbfounded, but what made him even more dumbfounded was the amount of EXP required to learn the swordsmanship after it reached level 5. The number was clearly written on the back. 100321. 100,000. Brando could not help but want to scratch his head. Was this F***Kerr playing with him? 100,000 EXP at level 5? Then after level 10 wouldn't the EXP increase by tens of millions? That's hundreds of millions of EXP. Lady Martha. P.S. There was a problem with the network in the afternoon, and it's only been fixed now. But it's good that it's fixed, or else I would have been scolded. F***CK, this guy just said yesterday that he would definitely release more chapters, and today he stopped. Isn't this F***King cheating me? Isn't this F***King cheating me? Of course, I can't be so stupid, so I decided to climb back up. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Cheatien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 478. After the 9 luminary sword art had reached level 7, Brando gave up on the idea of improving it in the short term. Level 7 9 luminary sword art required more than 250,000 experience points. Even with Brando's speed of extracting experience points from Mavakart's tome, he could not keep up. At level 7, the 9 luminary sword art could already produce 8 illusions. The illusion's attack power had also reached 50%. He was only one step away from the highest level, which was 9 illusions. Brando also discovered that the duration of the illusions was related to the level of the swordsmanship. When he first learned the 9 luminary sword art, the duration of the illusion's duration was about 0.2 seconds. But at level 7, the duration of the illusion's duration was almost 1 second. It was an increase of 0.1 seconds for every level. When the illusions of the 9 luminary sword art used skills, they would drain his mana. The method of extraction seemed to be converting the required stamina into mana. Charge required 6 points and Pierce required 20 points. Mana was much less than stamina, not to mention that 9 illusions were draining him at the same time. Brando had 250 points of mana, but the 9 illusions charge could drain half of his mana. Pierce could drain almost all the mana in his mana pool. If the illusions were to use magic, although the duration of the illusion's duration was not enough for them to use most of their spells, Brando just so happened to have the spell-like skill Tough Bark. He had tested it with Tough Bark before. When the illusions used magic, the consumption of mana seemed to be double. Brando used tough bark to exchange 50 points of mana for 1 point of armor, but the illusions used 100 points. Brando had also tested it. The illusions themselves could not use the 9 luminary sword art to create more illusions, and they could not take the initiative to exchange positions with him. After thoroughly understanding the 9 luminary sword techniques' operating method and usage restrictions, Brando began to look for people to practice this sword technique. The person he was most familiar with was the old swordsman, Coden. However, after 2 days of sparring with Brando, the old swordsman had complained that he wanted to quit. After returning from the loop of trade winds, Brando's strength had reached the level of a gold-ranked swordsman. Furthermore, the 9 luminary sword art was just too strange. Even with Coden's strength, he was still easily defeated. No normal person would be willing to do such a thing, let alone Coden's dignity as a gold-ranked swordsman. So the next day the old man decided not to come. Coden was gone, but Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles somehow heard that Brando was practicing swordsmanship and came looking for him. The Ash Sword Saint was never one to beat around the bush, and as soon as he found Brando, he wanted to spar with him. Brando was a little puzzled. With the Ash Sword Saint's level of swordsmanship, there was no reason for him to spar with him. The difference in strength between the two of them was too great. But this was in the category of someone giving him a pillow when he wanted to sleep, so he naturally could not refuse. What he did not expect was that Mephistopheles actually suppressed his strength and patiently sparred with him. As a sword saint, Mephistopheles was naturally more knowledgeable than Coden. When Brando used the 9 luminary sword art, Mephistopheles' expression changed. It was an ancient inheritance. Mephistopheles patiently countered Brando's moves and pointed out the flaws in Brando's swordsmanship one by one. Mephistopheles did not have much to say about the 9 luminary sword art. It was an ancient skill that was beyond his level. However, he was a master of military swordsmanship. In fact, the military swordsmanship of each country was similar in this era. After all, it was a basic skill. The only difference was that the swordsmanship of each country differed greatly. Mephistopheles had been practicing Cruz's military swordsmanship since he was a child. The Cruz's swordsmanship and Erwin's swordsmanship were closely related. After Mephistopheles' advice, Brando felt that his military swordsmanship, which had been stagnant for a long time, showed signs of loosening up. This made Brando both excited and curious. He was excited because if he could improve his military swordsmanship to LV16, the benefits would be earth-shattering. However, he was curious because every sword saint seemed to have their own unique understanding of swordsmanship. Orthless was like this, and the Ash Sword Saint was like this. Their insights seemed to be very beneficial for him to improve his swordsmanship after LV15. Brando could not help but think that if he visited all the sword saints of Wand and obtained their insights, would his swordsmanship directly enter the Holy Realm? Of course, this was just a thought at most. Although there weren't many people in Vaunt who could be crowned with the title of Sword Saint, there were still dozens of them. Among them, there was no lack of eccentric people, and there were even some who were evil. Compared to them, the Ash Sword Saint, Mephisto, was simply a normal person among normal people. To get the recognition of all these people, to be honest, this was an impossible task. Veronica was one of the extreme sword saints that Brendel knew, but he did not know if the Kurlut's goddess of war would be impressed enough to teach him her swordsmanship. Veronica had joked that she wanted to teach him swordsmanship, but the prerequisite was that he had to become a citizen of the Kurlut's empire, which was impossible. Clang. Brando, who was still thinking, heard a crisp sound. Halran Gaia clashed with Mephisto's grey sword, and a huge force almost made him lose his grip on the sword. He hurriedly retreated, and the 3 illusions behind him immediately blocked Mephisto's path of attack. Only then did Brando manage to escape. Mephisto watched the 3 illusions disappear in front of him. He did not intend to take another step forward. He sheathed his sword and looked at Brando, who was panting, and asked, "Were you distracted just now?" Brando nodded and panted, "Yes." "Then let's call it a day," the Ash Sword Saint answered curtly. Brando nodded again. However, he stood up and could not help but ask, "Count Mephisto, we haven't known each other for long, but it has been almost half a month since the loop of trade winds. I know your character very well. With your character, you would never lower your head or express goodwill to anyone, right?" The Ash Sword Saint did not say a word, which meant that he agreed with Brando's words. "Then you should also know my character. I don't mind joking about small things, but since I promised Lady Veronica to help you restore your kingdom, I will not go back on my word or delay the time." Brando paused for a moment. "I think you came here today to teach me swordsmanship? When do you plan to leave the forest?" Mephisto asked. "The druids have already prepared their weapons, and the elves and human mercenaries are ready to go. However, transportation for so many people is a problem. Even with the druids and tree elves' abilities, they can't find so many Pegasi in such a short time. Brendel furrowed his brows. Mephistopheles had asked the question that troubled him the most. He had an army now, but how to send them out quickly was a big problem. He did not forget that he was currently in the depths of the dark forest, and it was at least a month's journey away from Aween's borders. But at the latest, in a week's time, I will have the army move out, at least part of it. Mephisto nodded. I heard that your territory is in trouble. How confident are you that you can win? So he's afraid that I will lose? Brando understood. He could not help but look at Mephisto and asked, speaking of which, I have always wanted to ask Count Mephisto. Although I don't know what kind of agreement you have with the Duchess of Cruz, I have always wanted to ask. But you have chosen my ship. Do you know that my enemies are everywhere in Erewhon? Perhaps it is not a wise choice for you to choose my side? Mephisto's gray eyes stopped on Brando. The young man's wit reminded him of the young Veronica. No wonder that woman liked him so much. He smiled. Mr. Captain, you have many enemies, but I only have one. What do you think? Brando was stunned. He could not help but laugh. Indeed, the Ash-Sword Saint, who stood aloof from worldly affairs, only had one enemy, and that was the Cruz Empire. If Mephisto was not afraid of the Cruz Empire, why would he be afraid of the weaklings in Erewhon? So what do you mean, Count Mephisto? Brando asked. The Ash-Sword Saint looked at him and asked seriously, I came to ask if you are willing to accept my legacy and become the successor of my swordsmanship. What? Brendel was stunned. He resisted the urge to touch his face to see if there were any changes to his appearance after he left the loop of trade winds. Why did he suddenly become so lovable, and why did the flowers bloom when they saw him? Fortunately, he had the teachings of the ancient heroic spirit knight, Orthless. Even if a sword saint suddenly claimed to take him in as a disciple, he wouldn't be so shocked that he was speechless. He quickly calmed down and realized that Mephisto's actions might have political intentions. To put it bluntly, it was for the restoration of his kingdom. He knew that the Ash-Sword Saint was not a person who was interested in politics. The reason he restored his country was purely because of his personal beliefs. He was one of the few people in this era who was virtuous, but that did not mean that the Count was a fool. The Ash-Sword Saint knew very well that the duchy might be able to get his protection when he was around, but he could not always put all his energy into leading a country. His life's pursuit was still swordsmanship. Brando was different. Everyone could see that he was a lord first and a swordsman second. He could not even be considered a true swordsman. His passion for swordsmanship was even worse than Coden's. That was indeed the case. If Brendel had the experience of becoming a powerful wizard, he would not necessarily choose swordsmanship. What he pursued was the power that could help Aween rise to power, and not the mystical Tao. Mephisto was the opposite. He pointed out that Brando resembled Veronica as a metaphor. Veronica was the same as Brando. Veronica was a general and a duke of the empire. She was also a sword saint. Therefore, the gap between her and Mephisto in terms of swordsmanship was huge. Mephisto had been a famous sword saint for a long time, while Veronica's fame as the goddess of war was far greater than her title as the Azure Sword Saint. Brando calmed down after thinking about this. It was a good thing that the Ash Sword Saint wanted to accept him as a disciple. Mephisto's swordsmanship was at least an intermediate-level skill. It was not a bad thing to have such a powerful person as a backer. But at this moment, Brendel had already accepted Orthless's inheritance. Orthless did not care about the Darkness Dragon's matter because they were from the same generation, and it was understandable that they appreciated each other's talents. However, it was hard to say whether the female knight could accept a guy who might not be that powerful to be on equal footing with her. But to Brando's surprise, Orthless did not object. I suggest you accept it. Orthless was a little satisfied after hearing Brando's question. This meant that Brando did not only see her as a contractual spirit, but as a teacher. As a heroic spirit who had lived for thousands of years, she did not really care about this. But she was still very satisfied to find a young man with excellent character to be her inheritor. Mephisto's swordsmanship is very special. It's self-contained. After all, my vision is limited to 1,000 years ago. Odin only gave you the inheritance of his bloodline. In comparison, what he knows may be more useful to you. You don't have to care too much about my opinion. For me, as long as you can become stronger, that's what I want. Thank you. Brando was a little touched. Orthless's concern for him was like an elder sister protecting her younger brother. However, he did not immediately agree. Instead, he said to Mephisto, "Thank you for your kindness, Count Mephisto. But please allow me to think about it for a day. Mephisto showed a look of appreciation. He was very confident in his swordsmanship. If a normal person heard that he wanted to accept a disciple, they would have fainted from joy. But Brando was calm. For swordsmanship, it was necessary to be calm at all times. As a lord, it was naturally the same. Of course. But you should understand that I want to teach you swordsmanship not only because you are the future lord. It's not because I need your help to revive my kingdom, but because I think you're good enough to inherit my swordsmanship. Although I haven't spent much time with you, I believe in Veronica's judgment of people, he added after thinking for a while. You and Veronica have known each other for a long time? Brando could not help but blurt out. But he regretted it as soon as he said it. It was too gossipy and he could not get rid of the habit of gossiping. Unexpectedly, Mephisto did not mind this question. He nodded. The duchy where I am from has always been a vassal state of the empire. When I was young, I completed my studies in the empire. Veronica was my classmate back then. What? Brendel's gossipy soul was instantly ignited, and he could not help but yell out loud. He only knew that Mephisto was the archenemy of the Cruz Empire and had fought with Veronica many times. He did not expect the two to be childhood sweethearts. But just as he was about to continue asking, Mephisto cut him off. Do you remember when I asked you about your army? Brendel looked at the sword saint with a puzzled expression. His face looked like it was carved out of wood. Actually, this is not a problem. There are 2 Silver Alliance archmages in the Green Tower. Master Tullman and I have some history, or rather, he owes me a favor. I can ask them for help. Mephistopheles replied. A temporary teleportation array. Brando jumped up. A teleportation array that could transport thousands of people sounded unbelievable. If William and Tullman worked together, it would not be a problem. The remaining people could be sent away using Pegasi. This would solve the problem of transportation. He had been delayed for so many days. The biggest problem was how to send these people out of the Black Forest as quickly as possible. Even though the Druids had been gathering Pegasi, the Green Tower had just experienced the calamity of wolves. How could they gather so many Pegasi in such a short time? Brando immediately reacted and asked suspiciously, Tullman is a silver citizen. According to the Holy Oath, they are not allowed to interfere in the conflicts of mortals. He wanted to see how Mephistopheles would answer, but what he didn't expect was that this old-fashioned sword saint actually put his index finger on his lips and made a gesture that said, if you don't say it, I won't say it. Who will know? Brando was dumbfounded. Cheating? This is definitely cheating, damn it. Author's note, 4,500 words. This is the end of the war. The war against Tonagel is about to begin. Count Randner's influence may be great, but Madara is the real threat. Let's wait and see how Brendel will face Incersta's dragon and emerge victorious from this battle, and truly step onto the stage of history. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chitian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 479. In the name of mercy, I'll give you a chance to lay down your weapons and surrender. The knight raised his flag and shouted to the people below. Go back and send my regards to your lord. Hank unsheathed his sword and shouted. The knight shook his head as if he had expected this and disappeared from the high ground. Why didn't you surrender? Hatch could not help but ask. Is surrender the only thing you learned from Groton? The old scout turned around and looked at Hatch with his gray-brown eyes. Hatch was speechless. He did not know the identity of the old scout who spoke to him, but he should be one of the young lord's subordinates. He heard that he was also a mercenary and was one of the earliest to follow Groton. He seemed to be one of the mercenaries from the Red Copper Dragon. However, Hatch did not believe the old scout's words. No matter how he looked at it, the old scout looked like a professional soldier. A few days ago, he was the first to discover the movements of Count Randner's army in the forest and led them to escape. Speaking of which, the Paulus Knight did indeed live up to his reputation. He actually dared to use the Highlanders as the vanguard during the attack on that day. The Highlanders were good at fighting in the forest. It was said that when they moved in the forest, their movements were like migrating deer. In other words, unless one was an experienced hunter, it would be very difficult to discover their tracks. Hatch knew that this was not an exaggeration. Everyone in the outpost was an experienced veteran, but none of them noticed the movements in the forest. Hatch could not help but look at the old scout in front of him. If this old man was a scout, he must be the best of the best. But the old scout did not mind and knocked on Hatch's chest. Straighten up, lad. There's nothing to be afraid of. Abandoning Groton was the best decision you've made in your life. Now that you're a true warrior, you must show me the courage of a warrior." The scouts burst into laughter. They were surprised that they could still laugh at this moment. The Highlanders were the first to arrive, and they were trapped in the forest until they were finally surrounded by Count Randner's knight subordinates. Hatch blushed a little. He knew that he had misspoken, even though he was forced to work for the young lord. But Count Randner would still see him as a traitor. The others could surrender, but he had no choice. He used to be a brave man, but Grodin's hands had slowly worn away his willpower. He took a deep breath, and his mind hardened like the sword in his hand. The older scout scolded the others. "What are you laughing at? Get ready for battle." More than 20 riders faced different directions. In such a desperate situation, the recruits would have been scared to the point that their faces turned pale and they would be at a loss of what to do. However, these knights appeared to be calm and collected. Their breathing was even and their bodies were tense. They were as dangerous as wild beasts that were waiting for an opportunity to break out of the encirclement. Pay attention to the direction of the enemy's attack and look for an opportunity to break out. The old man's sharp eyes scanned the surroundings of the forest like an agile beast. He gave his temporary subordinates an order in a low voice. A sharp sound came from the cold air, and Hatch felt a rider beside him fall off his horse. He quickly grabbed the rider and fixed him on the back of his horse. After the sound of an arrow, the arrows in the forest were like locusts that blotted out the sky and covered the earth. Their ears were full of whooshing sounds. Hatch was distracted, and an arrow flew towards his face. But there was already a knight beside him who pulled out his sword and deflected the arrow. Banging sounds could be heard from the group of scouts. If it was a noble's private infantry, they would have already broken down in such an environment. They would either be frozen in place or run around aimlessly. But all the scouts, including Hatch, felt that the arrows from the left and right were getting weaker. Hank whistled, and he and his horse turned around in the middle of the group. He pointed his sword forward. The riders understood what he meant, and the 20 or so men and horses did not collide with each other. They turned around beautifully and charged towards the right. Knight Wilson felt a chill in his heart. The report said that the ones who killed Grodin and took over Abies were a group of rebels, but looking at the quality of the scouts below, they did not seem like rebels at all. Even the best regular army in the kingdom did not have such quality. He could only hope that it was just a coincidence. He immediately ordered his attendant to pass down the order for the knight to attack. The archers on both sides would definitely not be able to stop the enemy's charge. Even though the order was passed down, Wilson felt a little uneasy. The first to rush out of the forest were the infantrymen. The nobles' private infantry raised their spears high. Even though they could not form a formation in the forest, they were still a great threat to the riders. Hatch leaned back to dodge a spear that was thrusting towards him, and the blade of his sword sliced through the enemy's neck. It was the long-awaited feeling of a sharp sword cutting through a weak throat. Blood spurted out like rain and Hatch's nerves tensed up. He turned his head to the side to prevent the blood from splashing into his eyes. On the other side he saw 2 spears piercing through the back of a rider's abdomen. That person had treated him to a drink a few days ago. Even though the taste was not good, Hatch remembered that the person was a mercenary. The mercenary was on the verge of death, but his hand was still holding onto the reins as he charged forward and crashed into the noble soldier. The noble soldier was sent flying as if he had no bones. Then, the mercenary and his horse fell down together. Hatch saw that the mercenary was already dead by the side of the horse. Hatch could not help but take a deep breath when he saw this. He slashed the 3 men in front of him. The noble's infantrymen were at most at the lower tier of iron ranked, and some of them were even white ranks. He did not need to worry about them because of the difference in strength. Suddenly, a whistle came from the forest, and the sound of hooves could be heard from the right. More than 10 knights suddenly broke through the fog and appeared in that direction. "Turn around and face the enemy." The old man's voice came from the back. The situation suddenly became dangerous. The scouts were already surrounded, and only a dozen or so of the original 20 or so riders that had broken through the encirclement remained. Moreover, the originally low morale of the nobles' infantrymen was reinvigorated after receiving the reinforcements from the cavalry. These bastards were trying to restrain them and prevent them from escaping to face the enemy's cavalry. But when the others were unable to escape, a black shadow appeared. Hatch saw the old scout snatch a spear from one of the nobles' infantrymen and cut him down with his sword. The old scout then turned around and charged towards the knight with a spear in his hand. 1 man and 1 horse, like the champion knight in the arena, charged forward with an unstoppable momentum. Hatch was not the only one who was shocked. The knight of Count Randner was also shocked. They were all light cavalry and had never seen such a ferocious charge. While they were stunned, they were already pierced through by the old scout. The knight who was charging at the front screamed in agony, and his entire body was sent flying by the spear. But the spear was not meant to be used in a cavalry battle. The huge impact caused the spear to break, and Hank charged into the enemy's formation. He immediately unsheathed his sword and cut down another knight from his horse. Hatch almost bit his tongue off. In his opinion, the old man's strength was not that high. At most, he was at the level of an iron-ranked warrior, but not everyone could do such a smooth action. Which army did he belong to? This thought immediately appeared in his mind. Even Erwin's frontline army could not nurture such an excellent soldier. Especially the aura of a veteran, it was definitely not something that could be faked by an ordinary person. Hatch suddenly reacted and shouted at the others behind him, "Archers, archers! Cover him!" There was no need for him to remind them. A few of the knight of Count Randner had already taken out their longbows from their backs. They were about to surround the old man after their momentum was interrupted by Hank, but a few arrows pierced through the air and disrupted their formation. Hank took the opportunity to charge out from behind the cavalry's thin formation. The old man immediately turned around and raised his sword, nodding to his comrades. Seize the opportunity and break out of the encirclement. Hatch seemed to have been possessed by a god at that moment. He understood the old man's intention in an instant. He felt his blood boiling and adrenaline surged through his body, causing his eyes to turn red. He pointed his sword forward, and a dozen riders behind him responded in unison. The infantrymen of the nobles could no longer stop the crazy scout knight. Count Randner's knight of Count Randner's had just reorganized their formation, and an evenly matched opponent had already pounced on them. Knight Wilson almost fainted when he saw this scene. He originally thought that he had caught a juicy piece of meat, but he did not expect to kick an iron plate. He had more than 100 men and a dozen cavalrymen under him, but they could not stop more than 20 people. At least half of the enemy had escaped. F***CKU. How are we going to fight a veteran of the November War? Wilson was the most capable knight under Lord Paulus. Due to his rich experience in fighting against the Highlanders, he did not even think highly of Erwin's regular army, much less the rebel army. But this time, Wilson was sure that he had never fought such a strange battle in his life. He was much more knowledgeable than Hatch, and he could tell that Hank was a veteran of the November War. More than half of the veterans who survived the November War had received the Candlelight Badge before. Even if they were not knights, they would at least have half a fief. How could there be such a person in the rebel army? Wilson could not help but feel a chill run down his spine. He thought that he and his lord had fallen into a huge conspiracy. Just as Wilson was feeling the pain of losing his men, a steady stream of reports had been sent to Lord Paulus, who was now in charge of the army. This time, although this old knight had formed an alliance with two of his colleagues, with his rich combat experience, the other two knights could at most be his deputies. In this war, the only one who could be on equal footing with him was the famous general of Madara. Even though Tarkus wasn't considered young compared to humans, he was still considered to be one of the younger generation in Madara. In this War of the Black Rose, Madara's younger generation of generals had emerged one after another like the stars in the sky. Although the old knight Lord Paulus was working together with Tarkus, he could not help but sigh in his heart. Compared to Madara, his own country Awin was like an old man on the brink of death, with a gloomy atmosphere. For some reason, the old knight suddenly thought of the enemy, standing in front of him. He heard that the enemy was also a young man. All of a sudden, Lord Paulus was interested in his opponent. However, this interest did not waver the old knight's will. The reports from the front lines indicated that the vanguard had already clashed with the enemy's sentries. To be honest, there was no need to think about it. Most of the reports were of a tragic victory, and there were even some battles where they lost. One had to know that they had the absolute advantage in terms of military strength. The strength of the enemy was beyond his expectations, but this was not enough to make him feel troubled. Regardless of the losses, at least the enemy's sentries were forced to retreat to the north of the Glass River. Their tactical goal had been achieved. Next, it was time to take down Glass Ferry and cross the river. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 481. The scouts in the forest crossed the river one after another, and news about Lord Paulus's knight's army was sent back. Brando's young servant, the Shire, was wearing a long robe and holding a staff as he stood on top of a sentry tower. He looked towards the north as far as he could, then turned around and said, "The casualties are more severe than expected. The scouts sent to the north have lost more than 40 to 50% of them. These are all experienced veterans. In 3 days we have lost at least 50 men and 3 times the number of injured soldiers. In the end, he added, if I were his lordship I would have just packed up and run away. That's why you're not his lordship. The elven princess in silver armor glanced at him and answered calmly. Medisha was wearing a pointed helmet unique to the silver elves, which covered her small face. Her lips were tightly pursed and she looked very heroic. Is he plotting something by clearing out our scouts? Probably not. It's purely because he knows that we have subterranean dwellers in our hands, and he doesn't want to be attacked from the flanks. He doesn't want to repeat Lord Maxon's mistake. Medisha replied. He's really difficult to deal with. The Shire shook his head and frowned. I don't know if we can stall for 3 days. Count Randner's army has arrived. There's someone in the forest. The first reflection of light appeared in the forest, and an armored knight appeared in the forest on the other side of the river. Then more soldiers appeared behind him. The knight stabbed the flagpole in his hand into the soft soil of the river bank, and a sky-blue emblem unfurled in the wind. It was the emblem of Lord Paulus's hunting dog. There's also one in the north and east. So many. Soldiers wearing red and blue battle robes filed out of the forest, and there were no less than 1,000 of them. Are they preparing to attack the city? The Shire asked when he saw an archer shooting an arrow at the river Gree from afar. The arrow fell powerlessly on the river bank when it was about 50 steps away from the earth wall. Medisha shook her head. The enemy was just estimating the distance. They might launch a probing attack, but before that they should observe for a while. As the youngest princess of the Silver Elves, Medisha had experienced as many battles as the other Silver Elves. The atmosphere before the great battle did not make her feel nervous. Instead, it gave her a sense of familiarity. It was just that there were too few enemies. There were too few enemies. The Silver Elf girl shook her head. Medisha wasn't wrong. At this moment, on a small hill 1,000 meters away, Lord Paulus was standing upright on his horse like a sharp sword. Grodin's most trusted retainer was surrounded by knights. His hand was on the hilt of his sword, and his eyes were as sharp as an eagle's as he scanned the river bank from afar. Lord Paulus was the oldest among Grodin's retainers. Even though he had a personal relationship with Lord Maxon, there was a huge difference in their ages. Lord Maxon was in his prime, while Lord Paulus' hair was already white. This old knight could be said to be a veteran of hundreds of battles. Although his fame did not spread as far as Ampere Seal and Bucci, he was a character that could make children stop crying among the barbarians of Trentheim. The Gree River ferry was right in front of them. Lord Paulus had been here once or twice before. He remembered that there was a flat grassland on the other side of the river, but what he saw now made him wonder if he was getting old. The lush forest completely covered the ferry, and only the shoal extending from the woods to the mouth of the river proved that they had not come to the wrong place. This was the season when the water level of the Gree River was at its lowest. Even infantry could wade through the cold water and cross the river from the shoal of the ferry. There seemed to be fortifications in the forest in the distance. The sentry towers that stood in the canopy proved this point. Since when was there a forest here? Lord Paulus remembered that the last time he came here was only 2 or 3 years ago, but the forest on the other side did not seem to have grown in such a short period of time. The towering ancient trees needed at least 2 or 3 people to wrap their arms around them, and they were more than 10 meters tall. Not to mention 2 or 3 years, even 20 or 30 years might not be enough. There's a fort on the other side of the river. The sentry said that he saw a wall made of mud. This forest proves that the rumors of the Druids working for the rebels are true, one of Lord Paulus's adjutants said. The Druids have a way to turn the forest into this in such a short period of time? Is this an illusion or a forest that was transplanted from somewhere else? Lord Paulus looked at the forest in front of him. It was clearly a primitive forest that was easy to defend and not easy to attack. It was unbelievable that the Druids had such an ability. Even if the forest was transplanted from somewhere else, it would not be easy to grow it in such a short period of time. It was not that he had never seen magic before, but most of the spells cast by wizards were fleeting. Even though it was powerful, it was still acceptable. However, this forest was right in front of their eyes. It stretched for at least a dozen miles and was clearly presented before their eyes. It was neither an illusion nor an illusion. The knight beside him kept quiet. The Druids were a mysterious race. No one could tell what they were capable of. In most legends, it was not even certain if the Druids could cast spells. One said that the Druids were good at taming animals to fight for them. Another said that the Druids could transform into powerful animals to fight for them, just like the Beastmen. However, Lord Paulus quickly called for a wizard to explain the situation to them. The elder wizard was shocked when he heard that the forest had appeared out of thin air. The druids could accelerate the growth of plants, but they were definitely not this powerful. The fact that the enemy could create such a large forest in such a short period of time meant that they had a shocking number of druids. Or that the druids working for them were at least at the level of the druid masters in the Circle of Sky. A druid master was similar to the leader of the Silver Alliance's wizards. Lord Paulus did not believe that Brando had such people working for him, so he asked, how many druids would it take to create such a large forest in a few months? A few months? The wizard screamed and almost ran away. It would take at least a few thousand druids to create such a large forest in a few months. A few thousand? That's impossible. The rebels don't even have a few thousand people, a knight retorted. That means they have a druid grandmaster in their hands, or they have 30 grand druids forming a ring. A ring is a unit used by druids, and a ring of 30 grand druids is not inferior to a real army. The wizard replied gloomily. That's not right. If the enemy is so strong, why are they sitting here waiting for death? Could this forest be an illusion? Lord Paulus interrupted the argument and asked with what little magical knowledge he had. The wizard had thought of this as well, but before he could speak, the adjutant beside him shook his head. Our soldiers have already tested it. At least the first few are real. The wizard shook his head. It's more than 10 miles along the river. Just the first few are not simple. Can we attack with fire? Someone asked. The enemy has so many druids. Even if we attack with fire, they can easily extinguish it. Don't forget, they are the protectors of the forest. They are much more skilled in dealing with fire than you are. In any case, let's try it first. Lord Paulus made a decision without batting an eyelid. Let the soldiers prepare the fire arrows and launch a probing attack. Whether it succeeds or not, let's set up camp here. Let the knight of the grizzly bear domain prepare to chop down the trees. Count Randner's army had moved. A row of soldiers appeared from the forest. They wore gray-green battle robes and held shields in their hands. Their swords were strapped to their waists. The 3 rows behind them held long halberds, and long gray triangular flags were hung on the tips of the halberds. There were 3 knight domains north of Tonagel. Lord Paulus's family emblem was a hunting dog, Raleigh's family emblem was a grizzly bear, and Crewe's family emblem was a silver full moon. Thus, the flags raised by the soldiers were full moons. I thought the large forest behind us would scare them off. The Shire shook his head. Even though the druids had contributed precious magic seeds and worked tirelessly to complete this line of defense, there was still not enough time. This forest was actually only a part of the original forest from the fortress. The rest of the forest was created by him using illusions. The soldiers from Crewe's domain slowly moved forward. They were flanked by a large group of barbarians who wore ragged clothes and thick leather armor. They held sharp axes and round shields in their hands. The 3 armies slowly waded through the river and approached Gree Ferry. What did the Lord say? The Shire raised his hand and was about to give an order. They are just some nobles with shields and halberds who are not even tier 1 soldiers. Just get rid of them. Is there a need to ask for my permission? Stupid. Medisha imitated Brando's tone and replied. Tier 1 soldiers? What the hell is that? Seal's eyebrows were almost knitted together. His lord seemed to like to talk about weird things. He still couldn't figure out the level-up theory from Fortress Reeden, and now he was talking about a grade 1 troop class? However, he did not have time to think about it. Rows of Count Randner's archers walked out from the back of Crewe's infantry. These professionally trained longbowmen were all elites under Lord Paulus. They held their longbows and used their arrows to draw a trench in the ground. They opened the leather pouches at their waists and poured the liquid inside into the trench. It's oil. Fire arrows. The Silver Fairy Princess's expression changed. A fire dragon ignited in the forest. The human soldiers had already raised their longbows. Burning arrows were knocked on their bows. Following a command from the forest, the bowstrings vibrated in unison. The next moment, almost everyone in the forest saw a cloud of fire fly into the sky, turning the sky blood red. Then the cloud of fire stopped at the highest point and smashed down on their faces. Fire arrows. Accompanied by a scream, the fire arrows whistled and smashed into the forest. Fortunately, the trees were extremely dense and most of the arrows were blocked by the canopy and branches. Only a small number of arrows passed through the gaps and fell into the mercenaries' camp. The fire arrows did not cause any direct damage, but Lord Paulus, who was watching from afar, did not have any expression on his face. He was waiting for the follow-up effect and he was about to see it. The longbowmen raised their longbows and the second wave of fire arrows was already knocked on their bows. P.S. Update late. I have no way to go online these few days. I hope everyone can forgive me. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Jianghu to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 482. As soon as the fire arrows came into contact with the trees, they immediately burst into flames. The water in the trees evaporated and turned into thick smoke. The Crus infantrymen and mountain warriors in gray-green battle robes took the opportunity to sneak into the forest. The attack was so successful that even Lord Paulus, who was observing the battle from afar, raised his eyebrows slightly. But it was at this moment that a muffled sound of thunder came from the distant forest. A large patch of dark clouds gathered above the canopy at a speed visible to the naked eye. Then, accompanied by a flash of golden lightning, a sudden downpour poured down, almost instantly drenching the fire that had just been ignited. As soon as the fire was extinguished, the thunderstorm continued to spread. A few lightning bolts landed on the beach at the edge of the forest, exploding right in the middle of the Crus infantry and mountain warriors who were gathered there. After a few loud booms, blood and flesh splattered everywhere. The golden lightning bolts created a few large craters on the ground, and the rocks that were blown away fell on the heads of the soldiers nearby like hailstones. The soldiers of Crus immediately lost their morale. They did not care if there were still archers behind them as they turned around and fled at a speed 10 times faster than when they came. These nobles' private soldiers did not have the will to fight. Even though the Highland warriors who accompanied them were strong, it was a pity that this battle was meaningless to them. When the soldiers of Crus retreated, they naturally turned around and fled as well. But compared to the soldiers of Crus who were scared out of their wits and scattered like sand, the Highland warriors gathered together in an orderly manner even though they were retreating. The two knights who were accompanying Lord Paulus saw this scene from afar and turned to look at the true commander of Count Randner's army. They were shocked by the Highlanders' combat prowess, and when they thought of Lord Paulus who had led his army to victory over the Highlanders and forced them to submit to him, the two knights fell silent. Of course, they were unwilling to submit to Lord Paulus, but when they saw the performance of their own troops, they could only remain silent. At this moment, the dark clouds had already passed over the soldiers of Crus and arrived at the archers' formation on the other side of the river. A premonition of impending doom filled the heart of Sir Wiggins, the commander of the archers. "Retreat! Quickly retreat!" He immediately screamed, but he was still one step too late. He saw a golden net fall from the sky, instantly exploding among the three groups of archers. Almost in the blink of an eye, more than 2 groups of noble archers who had been trained for a long time were directly reduced to ashes. Sir Wiggins was struck by the lightning as well, but he was protected by the electric cage effect from head to toe. However, the adjutant beside him was not so lucky and was turned into charcoal. Wiggins crawled up from the ground, his face covered in dust and grime. He couldn't help but grieve. An entire company of archers had been crippled in a single round of attacks. Although they had only lost 20 to 30% of their archers, the rest had long since been scared out of their wits. They wouldn't be able to return to battle for a while. Not to mention that the dark clouds above were still surging, and the second round of lightning was about to descend. The archers immediately collapsed like the soldiers in front of them. They screamed and turned to flee. Mortals had no way of resisting such a powerful force of nature. Lord Paulus's knowledgeable and experienced knight subordinates might be a little better off, but they definitely wouldn't be the nobles' private soldiers. But at this moment, the sound of chanting suddenly rang out from the forest. The cadence of the incantation seemed to gather an invisible force in the air, and even the air pressure dropped a little. The dark clouds in the sky suddenly paused, and then dissipated piece by piece. In the blink of an eye, the clouds parted and the sun could be seen. The forest was silent at first, and then cheers rang out from the north bank of River Gree. "It's a dispel spell. There are at least 3 chanting points." On Brando's side, a druid covered in grass from head to toe listened attentively and said, "No, it's 4. The Shire shook his head. 4. The others didn't dare to refute. The first batch of druids sent to Abes didn't have any great druids, and the Shire could be said to be the #1 spellcaster in the area. High-ranked spellcasters were rare to begin with. It was said that Count Randner had 2 gold-ranked magi by his side, but this time there might not even be 1. If there are 4 magi here, it doesn't mean that there are only 4 of them. It's a pity that we don't know how many of them there are. According to the reports, there might be more than 30 of them, including silver-ranked spellcasters. From the looks of it, it's very likely." Cornelius replied. He was the nominal commander of the mercenaries here, and the more reliable Rabban was sent to help command the 800 subterranean dwellers. Other than that, Brando also ordered Copper Dragon Reto and the others to replace Yuta's mercenary group in the silver mine. Count Randner should not know that the silver mine had fallen, so Brando hoped that Reto would be able to surprise him. It was a dangerous mission, and Reto and the others were veterans of the November War, so they were naturally more qualified than Yuta's mercenaries. As for Yuta, she had already been transferred back to the front lines against Count Randner's army. She was also very satisfied with this arrangement. The beautiful red-haired mercenary leader stood beside Medisha and voiced her doubts. How can Lord Paulus have so many magi? Even if Lord Paulus has been on the front lines for years, it's still impossible. Don't forget about Lord Cruss and Grizzly Bear, but I think Count Randner had also transferred some of his own magi, or else there wouldn't be any silver-ranked magi. Cornelius replied. 30 magi. Ever since the November War, Erwin has never had a magi group with more than 30 magi. Count Randner really spared no effort to intimidate these small fries. Gaspard, who had been following Brando since Fortress Rieden, could not help but mock him. As a half-noble, he was very clear about Erwin's past battles. Gaspard's words made everyone laugh. They had more than 100 druids on their side, not to mention the fact that the young lord's magi was a gold-ranked magus. The young lord did not have a large army, but the quality of his soldiers was unbelievably high. Ordinary soldiers were either experienced mercenaries or veterans of the November War. At the very least, they were soldiers of the Erwin army who had fought against Madara. Very few of them were below iron-ranked, and some of them were even above the mid-tier of iron-ranked. Other than that, there was also a group of subterranean dwellers. Their individual strength was at least above iron-ranked, and there were quite a number of them who were at the peak of iron-ranked. The two armies added up to close to 3,000 men, and mages accounted for more than a tenth of this army. This was extremely rare in the entire history of Oween's wars, and it was simply inconceivable. If this news were to spread, it would probably cause an uproar in the outside world, and they would have to re-evaluate the strength of the new Lord of Tanajil. However, Brando deliberately suppressed this news because he knew that sometimes, a surprise would leave a deeper impression than an established fact. This time, the young lord wanted the whole of Erwin to remember his name, and who was the rightful Lord of Tanajil. Gaspard's words made the dark clouds in everyone's hearts dissipate, as if the forest had made Count Randner's army less terrifying. However, the Shire still had to give them a heads-up, and he waved his hand. Even if that's the case, the enemy's absolute strength is still much greater than ours. Count Randner's army is led by 3 Night Lords, and they have an army of 20,000 men. The Highlanders have about 10,000 men, which means that the army hidden in the forest in front of us, the Shire pointed to the north of the Gree River, they might be 30 times more powerful than us. Everyone became solemn again. This was something that they had known for a long time. Furthermore, the 3 Night Lords have elite knights under their command. There are at least 100 of them in total, maybe even more. These Night Lords are at least silver-ranked, and we just happen to lack such a force. The subterranean dwellers can fight against them, but Lord Randner made it clear that as long as Madara does not appear on the battlefield, the subterranean dwellers cannot appear. That's why the enemy has an absolute advantage in terms of silver-ranked fighting power. Apart from Lord Paulus, the Grizzly Bear Lord and Crust Knight are both gold-ranked fighters under Count Randner, and there's no guarantee that they don't have any hidden trump cards. Even if they only have 2 gold-ranked fighters, it can only be said to be a draw against Medisha and I. If there's a third, we'll still be at a disadvantage. Then what should we do? The Shire's words made Marlins a little dumbfounded. It's fine, just do as Lord Randner says. The Shire looked at everyone present. Lord Randner's words? Brando had told them to delay Count Randner's army as much as possible, but at that time, Count Randner's army was not as terrifying as it was now. There were 3 Night Lords and 30,000 Highlanders, not to mention Madara's undead eyeing them from the sidelines. Brando had promised them victory, but that was in the past. Could they still win now? Most of the people who followed Brando had a kind of blind trust in his words. The young lord's promise of victory had never failed, and as long as he moved forward, then the path of his sword would lead to victory. The young lord was like the most legendary heroes of the ancient times. When he proudly declared that he would obtain victory, then victory was already in his hands. But at this moment, everyone present could not help but be silent. They were warriors who had been through hundreds of battles, and could laugh and joke in the most dangerous of situations, but that did not mean that they were stupid. In their original confidence, the only way for them to win was to stall for as long as possible until Count Randner's army ran out of food and retreated. but that would require both sides to pay a terrible price. As warriors, this was not unacceptable because they had already sworn their loyalty to the young lord, and everyone was prepared to shed blood. But Brendel's promise to them was to completely defeat Count Randner's army head-on. How was that possible? The Druids naturally thought that the Shire was only trying to boost their morale. Yuta and Cornelius, who had witnessed Brando's miraculous feats, had a headache. Both of them could not think of how Brando would achieve victory no matter how hard they racked their brains. The Shire and Medisha looked at each other and smiled in the face of these various gazes. Indeed, because the upheaval in the loop of trade winds would soon spread throughout Erewhon and Wonde. Everyone would remember this battle. The young mage lifted his head, his gaze falling upon the dark forest to the north of the Gree River. Unfortunately, Lord Paulus did not feel the gaze that penetrated through the distance at that moment. The elderly knight was counting the casualties. In fact, the Kruss army didn't lose much. Only a dozen or so of the infantrymen were left behind. However, the fact that an entire squadron of archers had to withdraw from the battle before they could even see the face of the enemy made him feel a little heartbroken. Even though Brendel had mobilized more than 20,000 soldiers, he did not have many professional soldiers. He only had 1.5 columns of noble archers, and a large portion of them were the private soldiers of Count Randner. If he lost too many of them, he would not be able to report back to Count Randner. He could not help but turn around and ask, "That lightning just now was a druid's spell? Can an iron-ranked druid cast such a terrifying spell?" The mage beside him nodded. "That's a summon lightning spell, but 1 or 2 druids won't be that terrifying. The spell just now needs at least 10 people to cast it together. Furthermore, an iron-ranked would need to rest for at least a day after casting it. But if it's a druid grandmaster, then it's a different story." The old knight interrupted the mage's words. He still believed that there was no druid grandmaster in the rebel army. In other words, they can't cast that spell continuously? "My lord, there's no need to be afraid even if they cast it continuously. Compared to the 10 people they need to cast the spell together, we only need 2 or 3 people to dispel it. Moreover, that spell consumes a lot of energy for an iron rank, but the dispel magic consumes only an average amount of energy for us. Magic is actually much more useful for defense than offense. If I were them, I'm afraid I wouldn't use that spell again. They were probably just using it as a deterrent." The magus lowered his head and replied respectfully. Lord Paulus nodded. As long as it was not an AoE spell, he did not need to worry too much. The difference in military strength between the two sides was too great, and he did not need any extra stratagems. Moreover, the expenditure of 20,000 soldiers was too great, and he did not want to waste time. He planned to end the war in a straightforward manner from the start. As long as he crossed the River Gree, then taking Abi's lung would only be a matter of days. Ending the war in a week was within his acceptable range. Rebel Army Erewhon. These 2 words circled around in his mind, but in the end, all his thoughts turned into a confident smile on his face. As a general who had won countless victories, he did not have any reason to believe that he would lose when he had the absolute advantage. The old knight smiled faintly. It was a smile that represented pity for the enemy and a sigh for the kingdom. 100 years ago, he had never heard of a rebellion in Erewhon that would cause such a huge commotion. Even though his lord, Count Randner, had displayed his strength, it did not change the fact that the kingdom was on the verge of collapse. Not to mention 100 years ago, even 50 years ago, even in the most remote places, the lives of nobles would not be threatened. Lord Paulus sighed and muttered, Brando, is it? Let this old man take the last stand for this kingdom?" He threw his dagger into the middle of the map on the table where Abes was located. Victory seemed to be within his grasp. Grodin's retainer, a veteran knight, no longer hesitated. He ordered Count's army to set up camp in the evening and prepare for the final assault after a night's rest. They wanted to take down the enemy's defensive line in one fell swoop. Lord Paulus was not afraid that the rebel army would ambush them in the middle of the night. With his experience, he would not make such a low-level mistake. If the enemy was really that stupid, he would not mind ending the war earlier. Unfortunately, the enemy's leader was as shrewd as he expected. After a night of silence, the real attack began the next morning. The sky was just beginning to brighten, and Charles and Medisa could already see the shadows of countless soldiers in the forest on the other side of the river. "They are cutting down trees to build bridges. They are definitely taking advantage of our lack of manpower." Charles turned back and said. Medisha nodded. The test had begun. Both of them had the same thought in their minds. "P.S. I'm back. I'll be back to normal from today onwards. The weather is cold and I'll catch a cold if I go out. Everyone remember to wear more clothes." I'm not in the best condition, but it's the end of the month. I'll be leading a party tonight, so you don't have to wait any longer. Thank you. To be continued. If you like this novel, you're welcome to vote for it at Chidian.com. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 483. Battle cries shook the heavens and earth. It was as if black arrows covered the sky, and countless undead swarmed past her from the crimson earth. Behind her, she could not tell if it was the screams of human misery, despair, or anger. Freya tried her best to turn around, but she could not move. Then she saw a knight wrapped in white phosphorus flames riding on a skeletal warhorse towards her. The knight looked down at her from above, and she had to relive that burning gaze every night for the past week. But the dream was so real that Freya was too nervous to speak. She stared at the knight with wide eyes. You shouldn't have woken up. The fate of the descendants of the Valkyries is too heavy, the knight said with a hoarse voice. Don't give up everything for an unrealistic belief. The knight raised his sword. Back off or you will have nowhere to run. The voice was like a stern warning. The knight's hand moved forward, and the cold blade pierced her heart. Ah! Freya screamed in fright. She sat up on the bed, drenched in cold sweat. She could not help but hold her chest and gasp for breath. She did not know when this nightmare that tormented her every day started to haunt her. She did not know if it was some sort of omen, or if it was because of the pressure from the recent training. She could feel her heart pounding, but the sound of hurried footsteps in the corridor soon drowned out the sound. The dim light made Freya realize that she had returned to reality. The footsteps outside should be the knight's messenger. Ever since the war in the south began, the number of messengers had increased by several times. Large and small factions were temporarily attracted by the sudden war, and even forgot that the kingdom itself was on the brink of civil war. Everyone knew that the dukes in the north would wait until the snow melted before they would cross Ampere Seal to the south. In comparison, Rander's war was more like the appetizer before the main meal, as Oberway jokingly called it. This appetizer was a great mockery to the Erewhon nobles, but the nobles did not seem to mind. They were happily waiting to see how many teeth Count Randner had left. The question was how many teeth Count Randner had left. Of course, it was not as if no one in the Royal Knight Academy believed that Brando could win. At the very least, Freya would be anxiously waiting for news from the front line every day. The messenger passed through the long corridor and through the courtyard behind the dormitory, where news of the war was first delivered to Princess Griffin. The half-fairy princess coldly read the few lines of words on the parchment in her hand before putting it down. News of Lord Paulus's army clashing with the rebels had reached her, but there was no substantial progress. In a day or two, Griffin thought to herself. She said to the messenger, "Make a few copies and give them to the other lords." Should I call the other lords over? There's no need for that. There will be a tournament in the month of winter and a hunt in the twilight of winter. Help me prepare them, I want to see it personally. The messenger bowed and left. Cunning fox, Makarov could not help but shake his head and chuckle after reading the report in his hand. He wanted to put the report on top of the tall stack of documents on the desk beside him, but after thinking about it, he stopped and walked out of his room with the thin piece of parchment in his hand. He went straight to the Violet Count's residence with the report in his hand, but was stopped by a servant who told him that his friend had gone to the tournament. Makarov remembered that there was such a matter and hurriedly borrowed a carriage to go to the tournament a few miles away. The tournament in the month of winter had a long history in Erewhon and even the whole of southern Cruz. The events included horsemanship, spearmanship, and swordsmanship. The main purpose of the tournament was to prove the glory of the knight of each region. The youths were passionate about such events and the citizens could also satisfy their hero complex. In the Royal Knight Academy, such events were even more meaningful. The students of the academy would compete fiercely to prove that they were the best knight of the year and would compete fiercely for the crown woven from holly leaves. Preparations for the tournament started in the wee hours of the morning and there was already a sea of people in the morning. However, Makarov was indeed Bali's good friend. It did not take him long to find him in the crowd. The Violet Count, who was also from Lantern Island, was meticulously dressed in a purple coat with silver trimmings that matched his identity. There were 3 silver leaves on the cuffs of the coat that represented his identity. He did not wear a hat, but he held a goblet in his hand. He stood alone at the highest point of the wooden grandstand that had just been set up, enjoying the cold wind. Bali saw his good friend walking towards him and raised his glass with a smile. "I know you don't like to drink Toldo wine of 5 or 7 years. Actually, I don't like to drink any kind of wine." Makarov replied unhappily. "I know. Alcohol affects your judgment. I don't make judgments anyway. The Violet Count shrugged. Did you receive the news from Tanajul? Makarov did not want to continue the topic. You mean the joke about how many teeth an old dog has? Bali asked casually. I want to ask you, how long do you think the rebels can last? What do you think? Don't you think that young man has a chance of winning? Bali played with his glass. He has the silver elves and the dragons behind him. The silver elves are just passing by. What about the dragons? The dragons wouldn't think that their interference in the affairs of the humans would cause a backlash from the Holy Cathedral. No one wants to start a holy war, not even the most lawless Grand Dukes in the kingdom. That's true. But that young man is not as useless as those Meng family members. With Lord Paulus's personality, he might suffer a great loss. Makarov sneered. Is that so? I think he's laughably stupid. What do you mean? Bali asked deliberately. I thought that he would split up and drag Lord Paulus back to Tanajul. The cost of 30,000 soldiers is an astronomical figure, and with the distrust between the humans and Madara, Lord Paulus will definitely lose. But that young man has built a line of defense on the spot and is prepared to fight Lord Paulus in a fair and square battle, disappointing our Mr. Cunning Fox, right? Indeed, it's troublesome to have one less person to restrain Count Randner, but I heard that he managed Tanajul well. Perhaps he's doing this to ensure the next year's harvest. Have you ever thought that if he survives this battle, he will become a real threat to Count Randner? The Violet Count raised his eyebrows and asked. Makarov looked at his good friend. Bali laughed. Indeed, I also think that he won't be able to survive, but there might be a miracle. You know, miracles will always appear when people hope for them. Right now, we need this miracle, so I'm praying with all my heart. Maybe Lady Martha will give me a miracle because of me. However, it was a little too unreliable to pin one's hopes on something as intangible as a miracle. That was why Makarov knew that his friend was just joking. That was how Makarov always was. However, the two of them who stood at the top of Erewhon probably did not expect that their unintentional conversation would be overheard by a young girl who was preparing for the upcoming match. Freya, what's wrong? A female student nudged the girl who was at a loss, and the latter seemed to have just regained her senses. Why do you look like you've lost your soul? Are you thinking of a man? The girl could not help but giggle. What nonsense are you talking about? Freya's face turned red. When it came to matters between men and women, the noble girls were much bolder than her. Even though everyone was still talking about it verbally, the girl who came from the countryside of Buchi was still unable to take it. However, compared to this, she was more concerned about the things she heard earlier. She could not help but ask, Disha, who were those people talking up there? She was asking the girl beside her, who was her roommate. Her name was Disha, and just like what she said, she was a girl from a small noble family. She was chosen to be here because of her talent in magic. It seems to be the viewing platform for the nobles. Those people that are all big shots. The girl replied, small nobles like us compared to the real big nobles up there is like the difference between a commoner and a noble. If we don't get permission, we can't even talk to them. It's extremely rude. She seemed to have just remembered Freya's background and could not help but exclaim, I'm sorry, Freya. I didn't mean it that way. But then again, once you leave this place, you're at least half a noble. The girl said in a somewhat unhurried manner. Freya only smiled at her, but her heart was in a mess. She did not know what the situation was like on Brando's side, but now that the big shots who controlled the fate of the kingdom did not think highly of him, did it mean that the situation over there was very dangerous? After all, Freya was a native of Erewhon, and her reverence for authority was not something that could be changed in a short period of time. At this moment, she only wished that she could grow a pair of wings and fly to Brando's side to get through this crisis with that young man, or at the very least, die together with him. Freya did not know what she was thinking in her heart. She could not help but think of the little things that she knew about Brando. Of course, not all of them were good memories. She could not help but think of the time at the Golden Tree, when she went to look for him and the Roman out of goodwill. He actually scolded her in the Roman and often took advantage of her in the Roman. When she thought of this, Freya's face turned red, but for some reason, there was a little sweetness in her heart. But this little sweetness turned into fear and depression in the blink of an eye, and she did not even hear the voice calling her name from outside. It's your turn, Freya? The girl at the side could not stand it anymore. What's wrong with you? Are you feeling unwell? No. Freya only just remembered that she was here to participate in the tournament. She panicked a little and picked up the spear, but was immediately rolled her eyes. This is a swordsmanship tournament, the girl said in annoyance. Freya wanted to find a hole to hide in at this moment. Forget it, but don't force yourself. The girl sighed and looked at her a little worriedly. Remember to get a good result. Sigh, if I didn't know you well, I would have thought that you were infatuated with some guy. Freya had just walked out of the spectator stand, and when she heard this sentence she almost fell to the ground. Of course, she would never admit that she was thinking of Brando before. But it was easier said than done to get a good result. Her spear and equestrian skills were at the bottom of the rankings. Although her swordsmanship was slightly better, it was still not good enough among the outstanding youths in Erewhon. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Jianghu to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 484. Freya took a deep breath and walked up to the competition platform. This 10 by 10 square stone platform was specially built for today's competition. It was 1.5 meters above the ground, and it didn't matter if she fell off the platform or if she took the initiative to admit defeat, she would be declared defeated. Freya had already won 2 matches, but the more she progressed, the more powerful her opponents became. To be honest, she didn't have the confidence to continue moving forward. Thinking of this, Freya couldn't help but feel a little vexed. Brando had sent her here so that she could become stronger and protect everyone in the village. But now she couldn't say that she had achieved this. Compared to those monstrous geniuses, even her original confidence had been ground down a lot. Freya raised her sword. This time her opponent was an upperclassman. Maynard was watching from the side as usual, but when she saw Freya's state, she couldn't help but frown. You can't win if you're absent-minded. The upperclassman also saw this and couldn't help but remind her. Freya shivered and immediately withdrew her thoughts. She raised her head. For a moment, everything in front of her eyes overlapped with the dream. The red ground stretched endlessly under her feet, and her opponent became the knight who was covered in phosphorescent flames. She couldn't help but shake her head in panic, wanting to get rid of this illusion. But her opponent had already pulled out his sword and was coming towards her. Freya was startled and couldn't help but think of the scene in her dream. At this moment she had completely forgotten the essence of swordsmanship, and only subconsciously wanted to retreat. There was a roar of laughter in the stands. Apart from the nobles, there were also the students of the academy. They had never seen anyone run away from a competition in such a sorry state. Freya, what are you doing? Maynard couldn't help but frown and shout in a low voice. But at this time, a white light suddenly flashed on Freya's forehead, and a pair of wings of light stretched out from her back. With a ding sound, it knocked away the sword in the hands of the student. What is that? Beside the princess, several important ministers stood up. They had witnessed the scene in the arena. They only saw a flash of white light, and the sword in the hands of the senior student flew out of his hands. And this was not the end. There was a soft buzzing sound as if there was a resonance. Suddenly, a white light rose from the distance of the academy. That's the direction of the Song River. Someone among the nobles immediately recognized it. Before he could finish his sentence, everyone saw the rising white light suddenly change direction in midair, drawing a long arc as it headed straight for the academy. This is... Under everyone's watchful eyes, the white light landed vertically on the competition stage right in front of Freya. Then, the white light disappeared, revealing the true body of a stone sword that was inserted into the ground. At this moment, not to mention the others, even the person involved was shocked. Freya had no idea what was going on. She only felt that the sword in front of her seemed to be calling out to her. The voice was so friendly, it was like Brando's gentle encouragement. However, Freya's heart was pounding at this moment. She did not know what to do for a moment. The arena was silent for a moment. Not a single sound could be heard. Phew, Freya, you have a strange pattern on your forehead. However, Freya suddenly heard Disha calling out to her from below. She subconsciously touched her forehead and felt a piercing pain. She put down her hand and saw that it was covered in blood. Was she injured? How could this be? The girl clearly remembered that there was a flash of white light on her body and that the sword was sent flying. How could she be injured when the sword did not even get close to her? She could not help but raise the shining sword in her hand and look at her forehead. Only then did she realize that there was a beautiful azure emblem on her forehead. What is this? Of course, Freya did not know that this emblem had a famous name in Brando's previous game world. It was the Valkyrie's battle emblem. This was the proof of the glory that Martha gave her in her life. It was the symbol that all the Erewhon players believed in. It was the lighthouse and flag of Erewhon. However, she did not notice it at all. She only felt at a loss. She raised her head in fear and met Maynard's pair of dark and calm eyes. Pick up that sword. It belongs to you, Freya. Maynard had an indescribably complicated look on her face, but her first sentence was so resolute. Freya was startled. Maynard nodded at her again. The girl took a deep breath and raised her head to look around. Everyone seemed to be holding their breaths as they waited for her next move. She hesitated for a moment before gathering her courage and approaching the stone sword. She held the sword hilt and felt that it was cold. Then she gently lifted it. Then a miracle happened. Everyone saw countless rays of golden light shoot out from the stone sword. Then the rocks that covered the sword fell off one by one, revealing a golden longsword. The sword was more than 3 feet long. The handguard was like a pair of open wings. The Lionheart emblem was on it. The whole sword was brilliant as if it was made of gold. The Lionheart sword. Beside the princess, her teacher, the old man who everyone respected in Erewhon, could not help but shout in surprise. No, it's not the real Lionheart sword. It's different from the description. It seems that some rules have changed. The half-fairy princess was much calmer. However, when she looked at the sword in Freya's hand, her eyes flashed with an indescribable light. The previous movement seemed to be the awakening of the bloodline, right? She immediately turned around and asked Oberway behind her. It seems so. The bloodline of the Everton family is not that simple. Pay more attention to her. Just the Lionheart sword alone is enough. Oberway replied, speaking of which, the Lionheart sword appeared in the south and recognized a master. This time, the northern barbarians should be panicking. But first, we have to make sure that the little girl is on our side. A noble said with some worry, if the Lionheart sword falls into the hands of outsiders, don't worry. Freya is a simple girl. I believe that she will stand on our side. Griffin looked at him and replied, yes. Oberway looked at the princess. His eyes seemed to have some kind of wisdom that could see through everything. It was as if he was asking, is she really on our side, Your Highness? The half-fairy princess slowly calmed down. She could only smile bitterly in her heart. She thought of the young knight in the story. Indeed, even she could not tell who held Erewhon's future in their hands. Griffin looked at the sword in Freya's hand and could not help but wonder if this was the punishment given by Lady Martha for breaking the oath. But why was he spared? Lady Maynard, the expressionless female knight, turned her head and looked at Freya, who took the initiative to call out to her. She tilted her head as if to ask, what's the matter? This sword. Freya felt like she was still dreaming. The sword in her hand was definitely not an ordinary weapon. But why did the sword take the initiative to find her? She was still a little uneasy. This is yours, Maynard replied. But, isn't this? Freya thought of the legend of the Lionheart sword and her heart pounded. She was a pure Erewhon citizen and had grown up listening to those stories. But when she thought of everything that happened in those legends was related to her, whether it was the late King Eric or the Lionheart sword, she felt that it was a little too surreal. Freya, I used to know a girl who was similar to you. She was as stubborn and strong as you. She also had her own ideals. Maynard looked at the girl and suddenly said, at that time I was still young. I had always admired her. I remember that she had a sword that was similar to yours. Freya was stunned. That sword was sharper than this one, but not as strong as this one. Maynard said, I think this sword is more suitable for you, Freya. Maybe one day it will change everything. What do you mean? I don't really understand what you mean, Lady Maynard. I mean, don't you want to give it a name? But it's the Lionheart sword. That was King Eric's Lionheart sword, but not anymore. Then what do you think it should be called? I don't have a talent for naming things. Freya could not help but feel a little embarrassed. For a moment, Maynard thought that the Lionheart sword in the girl's hand was crying. But she shook her head and sighed. Let's call it Amber. Amber? Yes, Amber, the Amber sword. There is such a sword in the Cruise's Pale poem. It is the legendary sacred sword and the only one of all the sacred swords that allows the wielder to fight against fate. Maynard replied seriously, the previous owner of the Amber sword was the legendary Azure Knight. He pierced through the sky and caused the stars to fall to the earth, thus opening the second era. Freya held the sword in her hand and nodded. I understand, Amber. That's a nice name. The expressionless female knight suddenly felt that Freya was right when she said that she did not have a talent for naming things. But she shook her head and turned to leave. Wait, Lady Maynard, Freya called out again. What happened after that? After that? I'm sorry, I'm talking about the girl you said looked like me. What happened after that? After that? Maynard looked at Freya and smiled. There was no after that. How is that possible? Freya could not help but widen her eyes. But there was indeed no after that. Brando, who was walking in the forest, suddenly felt his heart palpitate. He subconsciously touched the stone slab in his chest. It was vibrating slightly. What's wrong? Quinn noticed his abnormality and asked. It's nothing. Brando shook his head. It was the Lionheart sword. But why would it respond to him at this time? It had been a few months since they last met. The feeling just now was strange. It felt like a contract. Brando felt a familiar aura from the other side. It even felt a little intimate. This feeling was too strange. Not to mention now, even in the game he had never heard of such a feeling before. But now, he could only suppress these thoughts because the centaur in front of him had cut through a patch of thorns. Then, a wide hilly area appeared in front of him. We're here. Brando took a deep breath. He raised his hand and signaled for the elves and mercenaries behind him to stop. The land in front of them was this legendary young man's territory. Everyone's eyes were fixed on Brando. This farce in Tanajul was about to come to an end. Author's note, the 2 chapters are close to 7,000 words. The cold is getting worse. Alright, I feel like I'm going to die. Or should I say I'm already dead. This is just a remnant of my will. This will is quite strong. Look, not only can it write, it can also act cute and ask for votes. Hurry up and vote. If you're good enough, there's more tomorrow. Students, also it's New Year and I forgot to say my best wishes. Let me add a new year. May all lovers be siblings and the cutest ones must be boys. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 485. Even though the soldiers from the Grizzly Bear domain and the Crus army were able to scale the walls several times, the resistance of the mercenaries far exceeded the expectations of the Erewhon nobles. Their attacks were neutralized at the last moment, and Count Randner's army was unable to advance for 2 days and 1 night. The battle was extremely intense, and the river of Gree was dyed red with blood. Lord Paulus remained unmoved. The Knight General was like a grim reaper who guarded the entire battlefield, stubbornly maintaining the pace of their advance. At this stage of the war, there was no longer a need to care about the number of lives lost. Victory was just a step away. The experienced general was looking for an opportunity to strike the last blow. Over the past day, the rebel army's geographical advantage had been worn down. On the other hand, the morale of the rebel army was still high. Suddenly his eyes lit up. Lord Paulus pointed in a certain direction. Let Lord Wade go up. Don't ask for my orders, he will know where to attack. The messenger was speechless for a moment. Is this how you pass down orders? For a moment, the nameless man even suspected that the Count had not slept a wink and was a little dizzy. But when he raised his head, what he saw was a pair of firm and hearty eyes. It was confidence. I understand, my lord. The messenger bowed. The night-song tiger whistled and gathered the people around him. Do you see that? He pointed to a corner of the forest on the other side of the river and asked. Everyone saw a red swallowtail flag appear in that direction, and several spears pierced through the canopy. Then, a whole group of cavalry covered in red armor appeared at the edge of the forest. The Crimson Banner Cavalry, that's Count Randner's private army. One of the mercenaries immediately recognized them. How generous. Another mercenary spat out. His spittle was stained with blood. How strong are they? The Nightsong Tiger asked. Grade 1 troops. Their mounts are ferocious horses and they are light cavalry. Their average strength is above iron ranked. Beside him, a tall and skinny elf with long ears answered. Unlike the others, he was also one of the mercenaries that Brando summoned. Humph, a fully armored light cavalry. The Nightsong Tiger clicked his tongue. The horses are not wearing armor, and they are considered light cavalry in terms of their mobility and weight. They are equipped with the three-eyed muskets of the Hazel people, and they are capable of long-range attacks within a certain distance. Count Randner must have invested a lot in this army, the elf replied. Did my lord say that? The Nightsong Tiger asked softly. The latter nodded. They want to attack our left flank. The left flank is filled with Cornelius mercenaries, and they are already showing signs of fatigue. The Nightsong Tiger turned around and pointed at the others. Unfortunately, there's no reason to let our old knight off so easily. We'll deal with the cavalry, what about you? Other than his own people, he looked at the other mercenaries present. These mercenaries were all elites selected from various regiments. They were at least at the pinnacle of iron rank. There were not many of them, only 40 to 50 of them. A day ago there were still 100 people in this squadron. The intensity of the battle was evident. Killing one is enough. Everyone chuckled. More and more cavalrymen poured out from the forest on the other side of the river, and soon, there were 200 to 300 of them. Wade sat on his horse and looked at his subordinates with satisfaction. This was the model of Erwin's most elite troops, and they were not inferior to the White Lion Legion of the royal family. Even though there were only 2 squadrons in this battle, he was confident that he could lead them to defeat any enemy that stood in their way. The cavalrymen whistled as they crossed the river. Of course, their sudden appearance attracted Medish's attention. The Silver Fairy Princess was standing at the highest point of the battlefield. Following her gaze, a rain of arrows rained down on the cavalrymen as if they were an extension of her will. The arrows fell into the river and splashed fiercely, but it was difficult for bows and arrows to deal fatal damage to the cavalrymen. The conical arrows would lose their momentum after passing through the deck, and some of the cavalrymen were still able to maintain their formation with 3 or 4 arrows. Wade was not surprised by this, as equipment was an important measure of an army's strength. The Crimson Banner cavalrymen were equipped with breastplates that greatly reduced the damage of long-range attacks. In his opinion, this was the greatest weakness of light cavalry. However, the noble knight did not expect that his enemies would be so diverse. The mercenaries were originally mixed, and the adventurers came from all over the world. Wade was just feeling proud of himself, but he did not know that the elven archers in the forest had already locked onto the cavalrymen. "Hanno, you take the left, I'll take the right." On a branch about 100 or 200 meters away, an elf covered in grass held a longbow and handed a green arrow to a human ranger behind him. Those two. Two bowstrings sounded in the forest. The Crimson Banner cavalrymen had just entered the forest on the south coast when the 2 leading figures fell off their horses like logs. Knight Wade was shocked. When he turned around, he realized that his 2 subordinates had been shot by the arrows at their throats. They had died on the spot. He felt his hair stand on end. He turned around and shouted, "Godly archers, be careful." A true sharpshooter was the nightmare of all heavy-armored units. That was because their heavy armor was as good as nothing to them. Their armor-piercing arrows could always hit the weakest and most fatal part of the enemy's body. However, in a normal army, professional archers were already precious, not to mention sharpshooters who could shoot from 100 paces away. Lords would often spend a lot of money to hire such people. However, Wade knew that the truly powerful sharpshooters were mostly elves and rangers. These people loved freedom more than anything else. Thinking of this Sir Knight couldn't help cursing in his heart. Where did these damn rebels come from? There were druids, rangers, and even elves. Was this the Forest Alliance? Or were they actually fighting a holy war? Once he thought of the November War, he couldn't help feeling a chill run down his spine. Over there. The Crimson Banner cavalrymen kept moving forward in the forest. Moving within the range of a godly archer was life. These cavalrymen were all experienced soldiers, so they naturally understood this. Very quickly they found traces of the enemy. Not far away, there was a figure quickly moving on a dark brown wall reinforced by vines. The slender elf with greenish-gray skin buried his head behind the battlements and maintained his position. He quickly approached the group of knights. The elf stopped to observe as a cold glow appeared in his narrow eyes. Then he kept moving while half his body came out from behind the wall, raising his bow. "It's an elven archer." The cavalrymen screamed when they saw the other side's posture. They immediately took out their shields from their saddles and raised them to block their throats. For children, the elven archers were godly archers from fairy tales, but for soldiers on the battlefield, the elven archers were a nightmare. Especially the blue and gray-skinned wind elves, wilderness runners. In a well-hidden trench not far away, the Nightsong Tiger peeked his head out to look before coming back in. He made a hand gesture to the others. "They're all veterans. It's a pity it's no use, hey." A cruel smile flashed through the eyes of the mercenaries, which seemed to have turned gray due to years of killing, and they really began to laugh. It was indeed useless. With a flash of white light, the arrow actually pierced through the center of the round shield in the hands of the leading cavalryman. It then pierced through the neck of this unlucky fellow before hitting the breastplate of the cavalryman behind him with a spray of blood. With a loud bang, the second cavalryman was sent flying off his horse. Then, the first cavalryman fell off his horse without a sound. A silver-tier archer. For a moment, Wild thought that he had fallen into a huge trap. The green-gray figure on the wall had stopped. He was now a cannon, but to Wild he was more like the Grim Reaper. Every time the green-gray elf raised his bow, at least one of the Crimson Banner cavalrymen in the forest would fall off their horses. Wade only felt that his scalp was in trouble, but he was still an excellent commander after all. He immediately drew his saber and waved it forward, ordering resolutely, "Get close, use your handguns to suppress that bastard." The killing power of a silver-ranked archer was too terrifying. By the time he finished firing 2 arrows in a second, the morale of his troops would have collapsed. The whistling of arrows in the forest was like a divine talisman, but at this moment the Crimson Banner cavalry displayed their strength as elites. Even in such a situation, the cavalry still maintained their high morale and charged forward. Furthermore, they were about to enter the firing range of the handguns. Wade heaved a sigh of relief. He ordered the cavalrymen to raise their spears and let the Crimson Banner flutter in the forest. Victory seemed to be right in front of them. As long as they went around the defensive line, they would be able to deal a decisive blow to the rebels. But it was a pity that victory could only be seen from afar. The Nightsong Tiger snapped his fingers. It's our turn to show off. The uneven ground of the forest was covered with fallen leaves and snow. However, at this moment, a row of scarecrows suddenly stood up from the fallen leaves. Of course, they were not scarecrows but mercenaries in disguise. Wade's heart skipped a beat and sank. It's a knight. The Crimson Banner cavalryman panicked. The Nightsong Tiger licked his lips and took a step forward, throwing an axe that was spinning rapidly in the air. Time seemed to have stopped. The Nightsong Tiger watched as one of the cavalrymen fell to the ground, while the other cavalryman raised his spear and swept past him. The Nightsong Tiger dodged the attack and raised his sword, opening a long wound on the cavalryman's waist. Rose-colored blood and warm white mist formed a string of sparkling pearls in the air. The cavalryman cried out in pain and used the momentum of his horse to charge forward a few steps before falling to the ground. Wade looked at the scene in horror. It was indeed a knight, at least the ones at the front were at least silver-ranked. Hope was like a fragile crystal statue that fell to the ground and shattered into pieces. Fuck the rebels. The noble knight suddenly felt a little sad, but he did not retreat and raised his sword. The knight's eyes flashed with determination as he charged towards the Nightsong Tiger. Die! A long arrow pierced through his throat. On the wall, the elf put away his bow. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 486. The Crimson Banner riders were torn apart in the forest, and the crimson-red swallowtail flags fell one after another. Lord Paulus' side was completely silent. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the hilt of his sword tightly. This is the mercenaries of Lopez mentioned in the intelligence report. They actually endured until now. The old knight closed his eyes, and his wrinkled face revealed a deep sense of fatigue. Lord Wade was a young man he admired, but there was no room for regret in war. Erwin had already lost too much blood. When he opened his eyes again, there was only a cold determination left in them. Since the rebels had revealed their trump card, the outcome of the battle had already been decided. Let the knights of Randner go forth and add to your glory. He waved his hand as if he had completely handed over the victory to the youths. The knights and silver-ranked warriors from Randner cheered in unison. However, the cheers did not evoke any joy in Lord Paulus' heart. Erwin had already fallen asleep, and just like him, the old man's gaze pierced through the dusk, as if he had already seen the thick darkness. When was there ever a time when even victory could not bring forth the color of hope? His eyes could only see the thick color of blood. What went wrong? The knights are moving. A cold voice rang in Yuda's ears. She turned around and saw Medisha's unchanging expression. The little elven girl was quite cute when she pulled a long face. She even had the aura of an elven royal, a princess general. Yuda nodded. Victory and defeat were decided in a single thought, and even she could see it clearly. However, she could not see the opportunity for victory. The previous battle had consumed a lot of her stamina, and even in front of the fairy princess she could not maintain her composure. Just like the defensive line, anyone could see that it was on the verge of collapse. However, Yuda could not help but look at Medisha in front of her in confusion. She wondered if it was the pride of the elves, or some unknown confidence that supported this little girl to be able to maintain her composure in such a situation. But where did her confidence come from? The female mercenary captain panted slightly. For the first time, she did not care about the anxious eyes of her own people behind her. She turned around and asked piously, "How should we deal with it?" A woman's pride forced her to not lower her head. She wanted to see where this general's confidence came from. She was clearly a child, so how could she understand everything on the battlefield? Did this elven girl really understand what she was facing? Yuda was very suspicious. However, Medisha was very clear-headed. "Blow," she said. Yuda looked at the fairy princess in disbelief. Even though she was covered in silver armor, she still looked like a childish general. What about Madara? Blowing the horn was a signal to mobilize the subterrane dwellers, but it was no secret that the subterrane dwellers were the last of Madara's forces. Both sides on the battlefield knew this. The subterrane dwellers were the last reserves of both sides on the battlefield, and whoever sent in their reserves first would lose the war. Medisha looked at her and calmly grabbed the spear beside her. "Prepare the horses for me. I want to lead them myself." Yuta was suddenly speechless. She grabbed Medisha's shoulder and said, "My people can't die with you. What about you?" Medisha tilted her head and asked. Yuta took a deep breath and nodded. "I'll go with you, little girl." Medisha smiled. When the long horn sounded in the forest, it was like an ancient ballad. Both sides of the battle seemed to feel the vastness of the ancient forest. Dragon horns and trombones. Lord Paulus suddenly felt that time had turned back, and he had returned to the days of war. On the battlefield of the Holy War there was only blood for blood. The old alliance was no longer there. It was a war without glory, but it was a medal of honor for the veterans. Lord Paulus licked his dry lips. "It's the subterrane dwellers. The subterrane dwellers have appeared. Are they going to fight to the death? These rebels are really worthy of respect. Where did they come from? Yes, where did these people come from?" The old knight suddenly felt a little doubtful. These were not ordinary rebels. These were the best of Erwin's warriors. But why did the best of Erwin's people always have his own blood flowing in them? The old knight suddenly had the desire to meet the young man called Brando. He couldn't help but think that perhaps one day the Erwin's people would be united again. But who would be the one to make this happen? Would it be the dukes in the north, or would it be the isolated princess? Lord Paulus felt that he might not be able to see that day. He closed his eyes as if trying to find the footprints of King Eric in his dreams. "Sir?" the surrounding knight asked hesitantly. "Inform Madara." Lord Paulus's closed eyes never opened again. The old knight answered tiredly. The knight nodded and retreated. But at this time, there was a sudden cheer in the forest. "What's wrong?" Lord Paulus squinted his eyes and looked over. His personal knight also turned around at the same time. The cheers came from the camp of the Mage Corps. Those guys seemed to be celebrating something. The old knight frowned unhappily. "It seems that the wizards have discovered that the forest on the other side is not entirely real. A large part of the forest behind is an illusion. They have been trying to find a way to get rid of this illusion. They finally found a way just now." A messenger immediately replied. Lord Paulus snorted softly. A group of 30 mages did not do anything in the previous battle, causing him to lose a lot of talented young men. Although those guys in robes had explained that it was because they were fighting against a wizard in the opposing camp who was far more powerful than them, the old knight always thought that it was just an excuse. A wizard who was more powerful than them? Wouldn't that be a gold-ranked wizard? How could there be such a talent in the rebel army? Sure enough, those guys who were mumbling could not be trusted. Lord Paulus couldn't help but think. But at this time they were still doing something important. Even though he suspected that they were trying to take the credit, it was not convenient for him to say anything. He just nodded to show that he understood. However, he did not expect the wizards to act so quickly. Soon, the sound of chanting could be heard from the forest below. Following that, a huge magic fluctuation caused even the ordinary soldiers in the forest to feel their hair stand on end. If even the ordinary people could feel the magic fluctuation, it naturally could not escape the eyes of a true professional spellcaster. In fact, when the wizards on Count Randner's side cast their spells, the Shire had already sensed the commotion on the other side. However, the young wizard looked at the acolyte who came to ask for his instructions and shook his head. "Don't worry about it. Let them dismantle it." "Let them dismantle it?" The acolyte was puzzled. "Nonsense, that thing is used to scare people. What's the use of it when the war has already progressed to this stage? Those idiots like to waste their magic. Just let them be. How low do you have to be to go crazy with those idiots?" The Shire immediately showed an expression of disappointment. He tapped the acolyte's forehead. "Wizards need to use their brains more in a battle. Do you understand?" The acolyte was scolded badly and hurriedly nodded. In fact, the Shire was definitely not the best choice as a mentor. At least in terms of patience, this young wizard's acolyte could not even compare to his master. He then looked at all the wizards and apprentices in robes below and shook his head. "Don't say I didn't warn you. Save as much mana as you can to prepare for the final battle. I didn't bring you here to let you die here." "Of course," the Shire shrugged. "If a person wants to die of stupidity, then there's nothing I can do about it." As soon as he finished speaking, a much louder cheer came from the forest. Everyone turned to look at the north bank of the Gree River. This time, the cheers came from Count Randner, Lord Paulus, the Grizzly Bear territory and the ordinary soldiers of Crus. Even the Highlanders were cheering. This was because the illusion of the forest was disappearing. This was good news for everyone in Count Randner's army. It seemed to indicate the arrival of the final victory. Their enemies had lost their last barrier. Tarkus and his Black Knight guards stood in the forest like shadows. Their golden pupils shone with a cold light, as if the outcome of this battle or even the battle itself had nothing to do with them. Behind them were thousands of undead soldiers. As they did not need to breathe, the entire army was silent like a steel wall. The one-eyed general's gaze fell on the subterranean dwellers who were covered in thick armor. Subterranean dwellers, he said as he put down the gauntlet and turned around. This is the trump card of those humans. Let's go, I want a Madara-style victory for the Emperor. The Black Knight unsheathed their shiny scimitars and replied in a low voice, with the will of the Mercury staff. But it was at this moment that the sound of a horn rang out from the forest. It was a long sound that lingered in the forest. Tarkus stopped. He seemed to be listening to the horn. It's the assault horn. They dare to attack. Lord Paulus suddenly shut his mouth. The cheering soldiers of Count Randner also shut their mouths. Because behind the melting forest, they actually saw something that shouldn't belong there. All troops pay attention. An unfamiliar army has appeared on the left flank. The enemy did not respond to the signal. It might be the enemy. The shouts of the messengers echoed one after another. When Brando parted the layers of branches in front of him, he saw such a scene. Rows of elven archers on Pegasi appeared on both sides of him. He turned around and glanced at Quinn. Where do you think their great chieftain is? You humans should call him a general, right? I think he's on that mountain. I'm just saying that because when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Brando looked at the tree elf leader in surprise. We don't have a great chieftain either. You're talking about the orcs? Quinn gritted his teeth. Something like that. Brando shrugged as he looked at the undulating forest and the river Gree that was almost dyed red. But I don't think Lord Paulus is stupid enough to expose himself in such an obvious place. That might be the base of one of his night lords. He thought for a moment, but it's something like that. As a surprise, I think it's enough. Brando turned his head again. Scouts, have you cleared the enemy's whistle? Yes, a centaur immediately replied. But my lord, we found a hunter's hut. A hunter's hut? P.S. I still have a cold and I even had a few nosebleeds yesterday. What a tragedy. Anyway, it's 2 chapters again. Students, keep voting, keep up the good work, and I'll update 2 chapters again tomorrow. Also, to answer a few questions. Some of the students in the comments section said that the background and setting are difficult to understand. How should I put it? As a self-created world, there must be a lot of background and culture. If I were to write these into a book, I'm afraid it would take up to 1,000,000 words. First of all, you won't have the time to read it all. Second, I'm sure I won't be able to handle it. Rather than that, it's better to spread it out bit by bit. If you feel that you don't understand some of the settings, you can choose to skip them and just treat them as background. I'll also explain the important settings in detail. You may not understand them at first, but you'll understand them after a while. Second, Freya's sword isn't the real Amber sword. Just a name. Maynard hopes to use the sword's will to fight against Erwin's fate. Also, yesterday on Cheba, someone asked if Maynard had transmigrated. I didn't answer this question because I thought that many people would want to know the answer to this question. I won't say much about the plot, but I can tell you with certainty that she didn't transmigrate. To be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 487. Most of the residents in remote areas such as Tanajul and Usong did not live near the city. Even in Wonde, the more prosperous the area, the higher the degree of urbanization. Probably because of trade and other reasons, there were a large number of craftsmen, monks, artists, city officials and their relatives as well as people who relied on these people to live in the city. But in Tanajul, the situation was reversed. There were many scattered settlements in the wilderness. Farms were scattered around the edges of the forest, and there were hunters' huts in the hills. The centaurs discovered this situation, and there was a family living in the hut. They were afraid that they were Count Randner's scouts, so they brought them along. The leaves on the trees rustled softly. The centaur warriors were tall and strong with reddish-brown muscles and purple and white battle tattoos on their cheeks and shoulders. They brought along trembling men and women with them as well as their children. Their clothes were tattered and their black hair was greasy and tangled. They looked like refugees. Brando glanced down the mountain. The forest was as dark as ink and flags of different colors intertwined with each other, but the sounds of battle were silenced. The entire battlefield came to a standstill because of their sudden appearance. He noticed that the soldiers of Krus were secretly adjusting their formation, and the grayish-green nobles' private soldiers were faintly discernible in the forest. But he did not mind and turned back. They are not scouts, just refugees. My lord, The man's eyes flashed with fear. Refugees who were caught by the nobles were usually beheaded. There were many headless corpses on the road from Dowling to Summer. Most of them were refugees while the rest were bandits. Who are you? The child broke free from his mother's pale hands and asked loudly. The sudden appearance of the army on the flanks caused Lord Paulus to feel uneasy. However, when he heard that there were only a few hundred of them, he heaved a sigh of relief. His index finger tapped on the smooth hilt of his sword as he turned around and asked, "Any response from the scouts?" No. Lord Paulus nodded. Only a few hundred people dared to appear? The old knight heard the knights beside him discussing in a relaxed tone. The soldiers seemed to be mocking the enemy for overestimating their strength. Even though an arrogant army was bound to lose, there was no general who did not like a confident army. He was very satisfied with the morale of his subordinates. The enemy's reinforcements seemed to have become a laughing stock. The reinforcements are stopping. Haha, he's probably considering whether to retreat or flee. Coward, if you had caught us off guard when you first appeared, you might have been able to catch us off guard. What a waste of time. To be able to circle around our flank, they must be quite capable. That's because Krus is too incompetent. Lord Paulus couldn't help but shake his head. Who would consider the enemy? His subordinates were a little too arrogant. He took a deep breath and replied, "If there's no response, then they're enemies. Have the Krus men stop them. They've already lost enough face. The morale of the army could be used. Then let's go." The old knight pulled down his mask and stood up from the rock. His attendants had already brought his warhorse to him, and his knights were already ready to go. Even the slightest change on the battlefield could not change his decision. Although Lord Paulus was cautious, he had the decisiveness of a general. He nodded to the attendant, and the metal armor clanked as it rubbed against each other. The attendant in leather armor picked up the horn hanging at his waist and blew it. A clear battle cry pierced through the forest. Then countless soldiers walked out of the forest. They were dressed in red and blue battle robes, with iron helmets on their heads and long swords on their waists. They held eagle shields in one hand, and their iron gauntlets made cracking sounds as they stepped on the dead wood. The small groups of soldiers converged into a torrent, as if they had filled up all the gaps in the forest. The noble's private army was arranged in a few huge square formations. Like water flowing slowly through the battlefield, the scattered arrows were thrown into the formation. Even if one of the soldiers fell, the soldiers behind would immediately fill the gap. The enemies in front of them seemed endless, and it made them feel helpless. The army was approaching. The mercenaries who were still resisting in the forest couldn't help but put down the bows in their hands. The appearance of an army of tens of thousands was enough to make the earth tremble. Everyone swallowed a mouthful of saliva. Medisha was dressed in silver armor and sat on her unicorn. Her helmet was sealed and only her eyes, small nose and mouth were exposed. The fairy princess pursed her lips and held onto her long shuttle as she watched the scene in front of her without saying a word. Behind her were Yuta, Rabin, and nearly 1,000 subterrane dwellers. The subterrane dwellers were hunched over, covered in black and spiked armor. They held huge spears in their hands like war monsters. However, this army did not block the path of Count Randner's army. Medisha was silently watching the battle. Yuta did not understand. Are we not going to attack? They are not our enemy, Yuta. I never said that our target was not Madara. Medisha looked at the distant mountain and replied. But they can't stop us. The female mercenary leader looked at the approaching army with slight nervousness. My lord has his own plans. Medisha looked back at her and smiled slightly. Her calm eyes were filled with unquestionable trust. You're too nervous. My lord doesn't have many people with him. Yuta looked at Medisha strangely. Enough. Medisa said, I'm the main commander of this reserve force. First of all, I have to obey the tactical arrangements. My lord said he can do it, so I have to believe in his judgment. Our target is Madara. I think I'm crazy. Yuta shook her head and muttered. Medisha smiled. Thank you for accompanying me, Yuta. You're just a little girl. Yuta sighed and thought of her sister. She touched her sword and suddenly felt that her hand was a little cold. Brando looked at the thin boy. The mother ran over and protected her child in fear. She raised her head and looked at him with pleading eyes. "My lord, the enemy is moving." At this time one of the mercenaries said. Brando nodded and looked back. "I'm your rightful lord. No matter if you're refugees or my people, as long as you live in Tanajil, I will protect you. Just remember this and that's enough." After that he pulled the reins and was about to leave. But at this time, to everyone's surprise, the child loudly retorted, "Liar, you're all bad people." Brando was startled and could not help but stop. "Father said that if you weren't here there wouldn't be a war." "My lord?" The man pulled his son with an uneasy expression. He. Brando shook his head and looked back at the people he brought out of the Black Forest. Everyone was also looking at him, the tree elves, the centaurs, the druids, and the human mercenaries. Brando nodded at them, then jumped off the horse and pulled out his sword in front of everyone's eyes. The poor woman suddenly let out a frightened scream, but Brando walked to her side and held her skinny hand. He gently shook his head and comforted her. "It's okay, don't worry." The woman and the man looked at him nervously. He turned back and patted the little boy's face. "You're a little man, let me ask you a question." The little boy stared at him. "If one day someone wanted to take your parents away from you, what would you do?" "If they dare, I'll beat them." The little boy answered confidently. "Well said." Brando praised. "Then let me ask you, little man, if one day someone wants to take you away from me, take away this country, guess what I'll do?" The little boy looked at him with a puzzled expression. "I'll beat them up too." Brando smiled faintly. He got up on his horse and pointed his sword forward. Count Randner's army was moving in the forest, but the two armies were still looking at each other from afar. The situation in Tanajil, and even the whole of Erewhon, seemed to be gathering into this final confrontation. Who will be able to change the fate of the kingdom? Brando looked forward but turned his head. "So you all heard it? Beat them up." The mercenaries roared in response. "Beat them up." The centaur's blood was boiling. This was the life they pursued. They chased after glorious battles until the last drop of blood was shed. Perhaps war itself was meaningless, but the most precious thing between faith and hope was always worthy of respect. The tree elves placed their bows in front of their chests and sang the war song that was widely spread between the humans and elves in the early years. The eagle Jianghu, bow and crossbow high, light triumphs over darkness, hope protects faith. It was an ancient song that was spread before the War of the Holy Saints. At that time, the intelligent beings of the land were still able to unite against the dark dragon and sign a sacred and solemn oath. But in the blink of an eye, 1,000 years had passed. Brando and Quinn looked at each other and smiled. "How do we fight?" the leader of the tree elves asked. "You will stop Count Randner's army," Brando replied casually. "Since Lord Paulus wants Crust to stop me, I will crush his left wing. These nobles always like to look down on people, and I hope they will remember this lesson from today onwards." "You alone?" Quinn looked at him in surprise. "Me alone?" Brendel shook his head with a smile. He turned his head, put his index finger and thumb to his lips, and blew a long whistle. The whistle traveled far and wide in the dark coniferous forest, and everyone on both sides could hear it. The forest suddenly became quiet. Suddenly, a wolf's howl could be heard from afar. A moment later, howls echoed through the forest. The distant howls seemed to be approaching at an astonishing speed. In just a moment, the howls seemed to be right next to their ears. The earth began to tremble as if 10,000 horses were galloping. Lord Paulus pulled on the reins of his warhorse and stopped. The old knight's expression changed slightly under his iron mask. All the knights around him also stopped and turned their heads towards the direction of the howls. It was a pack of wolves, and not just any wolves. The people who lived at the edge of the Black Forest naturally knew what kind of creature the howls came from. Black wolves? The first to panic were the mountain people. They had lived in the wilderness for generations, and there were countless legends about these terrifying creatures. There was only one thing they could think of at this moment. The wolf tide. The wolf tide is coming. The old knight's face turned pale. Quinn looked at Brando, who was standing alone in the midst of the galloping wolves like a knife. It was as if he was looking at a mythical wolf herder. Brando turned his head and smiled at him. "Is that enough?" Quinn did not say a word. He raised his bow and gestured for the tree elves to attack. In an instant, countless Pegasi soared into the sky from the forest. Author's note: my cold is slightly better, but I have to go out to get some medicine, so I'll stop here for today. Tomorrow, Brando will start his killing spree. Maybe I'll give him a little boost. Also, those comments in the book review section that said, "I'll combine my breasts," please have some self-respect. Can you be any more vulgar? Brando felt that the Lionheart was indeed a divine weapon, and the Lionheart was indeed a fantasy weapon. As for the reason, I'll leave it to you to guess. Also, Mothering, I found out that you were talking bad about me in the book review section. The Nightwing staff is a bug in itself. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 488. The Black Wolf Overlord was running at the front. Its fur was black and as hard as steel spikes. Its eyes seemed to be burning with green flames, making it look like a demon that had just been born in hell. As it ran, its 4 feet landed on the ground, and its sharp claws and teeth shone with a cold light. It ran wildly on the withered leaves in the forest. The soldiers could not catch up with its speed. They could only watch as it ran from another mountain to the valley, and then from the valley to the forest on the other side. All the arrows landed behind it, and they could only watch as it approached. The herald trembled as he ordered the soldiers to put down their spears. However, Kruss's noble soldiers retreated in waves, and visible ripples appeared on the battlefield. Kruss and his knights were supposed to supervise the battle, but the calamity of wolves was the nightmare of Tonajal and the people of the forest for generations. The dark shadows in the forest were the signs of the end of the world. The knights' faces turned pale. Why did we encounter these things? Kruss cursed. Kruss's soldiers were still able to hold their ground, but the mountain people were even more afraid of the calamity of wolves. Some of the tribes at the back had secretly dispersed, and the tribes at the front were also in a mess. This was a fear that had been ingrained in their hearts since childhood. Once it spread, it would be like a disaster falling from the sky. Even the bravest warriors would lose their courage and throw away their armor. The black wolves were less than 100 steps away from the front of the formation. The archers' projectiles had no effect on them. Kruss was a gold-ranked warrior, and his eyesight was excellent. He could see that the soft arrows could not even penetrate the fur of the black wolves. The army behind him was moving forward. The Grey Bear Lord was cunning and indecisive. He could not rely on him. He could only order his soldiers to move forward. Men could not outrun the black wolves, and neither could horses. Kruss had lived in the south for 30 years and he knew this very well. The cold air in the forest was oppressive, but the coldness in the heart was even colder. There were only a few hundred black wolves and they looked like colts. They were so fast that it seemed like there was no end to them. His palms were sweating, and it condensed on the hilt of his sword. It was as if his breathing had stopped. However, a young knight ran out of the forest first. Brando raised his head. Kruss first thought that it was one of his scouts, but then he realized that it was not. The young man raised his head and looked at him. The two of them looked at each other from a distance, but he felt as if he had been completely seen through. Who are you? Kruss had a bad feeling. Lord Kruss, do you still dream of turning back on the battlefield of Candor? You lost your honor on the battlefield and I've brought it back to you. Brando's words made him cry out loudly. His face was deathly pale, as if he had fallen into the deepest nightmare. Lord Kruss pointed a trembling finger at Brando and stammered, You. 20 years ago he abandoned his comrades on the battlefield and fled. He thought that no one knew about it, but today a young man had exposed him. Brando didn't say anything. He didn't mean to mock the other party. Just as he said, he only wanted to bring back the lost glory for the other party. Behind him, the pack of black wolves surged out like a tide. Horses and wolves were creatures that opposed each other, but Brando, who was riding on a horse, was able to stand tall in the middle of the pack of wolves without moving at all. This strange scene made people feel even more terrified. Then the black wolf collided with the noble soldiers of Kruss. It was as if black paint had blended into the gray-green battle line. At that moment, time seemed to slow down. The spears that were placed horizontally on the body of the black wolf, but even the metal spears couldn't penetrate the hard fur of the black wolf, let alone the rock deck below. The spears were bent and cracked along the grain. Crack, crack, crack. The broken wood chips caused a cloud of smoke to rise from the first line of defense. Most of the noble soldiers of Kruss were only at the white rank. Most of the officers in the infantry were only at the iron rank, so how could they be a match for the silver-ranked black wolves? The first line of defense formed by thousands of infantrymen was pierced through in an instant, turning into a sieve full of holes. The human soldiers began to retreat, mixed with cries and screams. Lord Kruss seemed to have just woken up from his nightmare. He immediately ordered his knight to stabilize the second line of defense. The knight's strength was at the silver rank. As soon as they entered the formation, they took over the command and tried to stabilize the morale of the soldiers with the help of the common soldiers. However, the Kruss formation had already begun to collapse towards the center. The wolves tore a huge hole in the middle, and the center of the hole was pointed towards Lord Kruss, who was at the top of the mountain. Perhaps it was because of Brando's words, the knight of Count Randner did not retreat. He held his long sword and silently watched the development of the battle below. The knight's orders were to enter the two flanks, and the two flanks that suffered the least attacks from the black wolves quickly stabilized. The Kruss soldiers gradually realized that the number of black wolves was actually not that high. After a commotion, the soldiers began to attempt to surround them from the back. Did they give up on the main formation? What a bold decision. Brando raised his head and looked at Lord Kruss from afar. The distance between them was less than a kilometer. This distance was neither close nor far in the battlefield of Wonde, and it could be said that it was a test of the courage and wisdom of the commanders on both sides. Lord Kruss stood there motionlessly looking at him. He actually wanted to use himself as a stake to surround him and the wolves. Such courage did not surprise Brando because he had already expected this. In just a short moment, the wolves were completely surrounded. 200 black wolves and more than 100 iron-ranked shadow rock beasts were facing 10 times the number of human soldiers. Retreating was no longer an option. Both sides were competing to see who would achieve victory first. Brando raised Haurangaya. The wolves automatically opened up a path for him. The Pegasus he was riding on seemed to feel its master's urging and began to accelerate. His mount was not an ordinary Pegasus, but a gift from the tree elves. This Pegasus was a spirit of nature with the silver blood flowing through its veins. It was the descendant of the holy horse Kaliner, a silver seed, a mythical creature on the same level as the unicorn. It was stronger and faster than the average Pegasus, and it had the ability to control plants in the wind. Brendel was riding on the wings of the wind, flying with the wind. Like an elongated white line, there were no more wolves in front of him. Instead, there were pale-faced human soldiers with spears in their hands. Brando drew an arc with the sword in his hand, as if 7 swords had appeared at the same time. Clang, 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 clang. More than 10 spears were sent flying by him. Brando stretched out his left hand and shouted, "Gale, grant me authority." This was the elementalist's second circle wind spell, Beam Current. The burst of air erupted in a scattered manner, creating a hurricane behind Brando. He moved forward, and the wall of wind also moved forward. The soldiers in front of him were pushed away, forming a hemispherical human wall. The human wall dispersed in midair, and these unlucky fellows fell far into the crowd. The Black Wolf Lord walked side by side with its master. It was born with the strength of a peak silver tier, and after its stone transformation, its shoulder armor, forehead, and back grew a ribbon-like rock plate, greatly increasing its strength and defense. At this moment, it was already close to the early gold tier. Ordinary soldiers could not get close to it at all. Its howl alone was enough to make a group of people weak in the knees. One man and one wolf, in the blink of an eye, opened up a 50-meter-long path in the crowd. Behind them, the pack of black wolves followed, widening the passage. But 2 knights came out from the side, one on the left and one on the right, trying to block Brando's path. Brando waved Haurangaya in his hand, and with a flash of sword light, the upper body of the 2 knights and the head of the war horse flew high into the air. An instant kill of a silver tier. At this moment, all the nobles who were rushing forward were terrified and stopped in their tracks. This was a gold tier battle, and it was no longer a battle that mortals like them could participate in. Brendel urged his horse forward again, and the enemy soldiers actually retreated to open up a path for him. It was a strange sight, as though they had switched sides on the battlefield. Lord Kruss's face also changed. Such a young gold tier, he was definitely one of Erwin's most talented geniuses. And this was not even the early gold tier. Seeing Brando's elemental domain shining with light, Lord Kruss felt the hope in his heart turn to ice. What the hell is going on, these rebels? But Brando saw that Lord Kruss still had no intention of moving, and he understood. He looked around and saw that there were 2 gold tier fluctuations in the crowd. Sure enough, there was an ambush and there were more than 2 gold tiers. He looked at the 2 swordsmen who were charging towards him. They were both at the beginning of the gold level, unfamiliar faces. They were either secretly trained or hired. Of course, the great aristocrats were rich. Brando did not show any signs of nervousness. He continued to charge forward, raising his sword and slashing at the first gold-tier swordsman charging at him. He did not hold back in the slightest as he charged forward with his horse. His sword was like a shooting star, moving forward with an indomitable will. The gold-tier swordsman from the Randner family was scared out of his wits. He had never seen such a crazy person who completely gave up on defense even though he knew it was a 1 versus 2 battle. This sword strike was clearly, I'll give you a stab even if I have to give up my life. It was not a technical move, but it was enough to make people go crazy. But of course he did not want to die together with Brando, but the sword was too fast and he could not dodge it in time. He could only raise his sword to parry. He was already extremely depressed in his heart. Originally, he had taken the initiative to attack first, but he was suppressed by the other party's crazy fighting style. He could only hope that his companion would be able to catch Brando's desperate attack. They had worked together for many years, and would not let go of such an obvious opportunity. However, what happened next caught him by surprise. Brando's sword clashed with his sword, and the huge force almost broke his hand. The swordsman staggered backward, cursing in his heart as he tried to regain his balance. But when he looked up, he saw that Brando did not seem to need to find his center of gravity again, and the sword was already coming at him perfectly. The swordsman was shocked out of his wits. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Jianghu to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 489. How is this possible? The gold-ranked swordsman's eyes nearly popped out of their sockets when he saw Brendel's attack. Brendel had used up all of his strength to execute a perfect attack, and if a normal person did not manage to land a blow like that, they would be in a state of paralysis. But Brendel did not even bother to pull back his sword, and immediately followed up with another attack. No matter how he looked at it, it was a strike that used up all of his strength. There was almost no difference between this strike and the previous one. It was a complete reversal of the laws of physics. It was as if two people had struck out at the same time. The gold-tier swordsman from the Diener family could not comprehend it, and he did not need to. If he did not raise his sword to block the strike, he would have to say goodbye to this world. However, he could imagine that if he tried to block the strike, he would be smashed to the ground. He did not even have the time to regain his balance. But he could not care about that at this moment. The gold-tier swordsman from the Diener family wanted to cry, but no tears came out. He did not know what was going on and could only raise his sword. Then, with a loud bang, Brendel was sent flying along with his sword. It was as if he was swatting a dead fly as he fell to the ground. The two strikes were completed in an instant. In the eyes of the bystanders, Brando seemed to have transformed into two figures and slapped the swordsman to the ground as if he was teaching a child a lesson. It was at this moment that the swordsman's companion arrived. In fact, the second swordsman who had just arrived was also going crazy. If it was any other time, the difference of a few tenths of a second would not have much of an effect. But this time, when the second swordsman arrived, he discovered that Brendel's third sword was already on its way to his fallen comrade. It was as though the second sword had not returned, and the third sword was already on its way. If he could, the swordsman from Count Ayre's family wanted to bang his head on the ground and bawl out loud, "This bastard is using a cheat." But he did not have the time to do so. He realized that if he did not act now, his companion would really die. Even though he was also a gold-tier swordsman, he did not even have the chance to retaliate before he was forced to retreat. This was unacceptable. He immediately drew his sword. In theory, Brando's 3 consecutive strikes meant that he had given up all his defense and attacked his companion with all his might. Even if he did not seize the opportunity to seize the opportunity, he would at least be able to achieve his goal of attacking Brando. However, the swordsman from the Diener family vomited blood when he saw Brando completely ignoring him and stabbing his sword into the heart of the swordsman who was lying on the ground with an expression of disbelief. The expression on the face of the swordsman saying, "Do you hate me that much? Do you not care for your own life?" But at the same time he saw Brendel's sword slashing towards him. A perfect slash with all his strength. This is impossible. The swordsman from the Diener family almost dropped his sword and screamed as he clutched his head. But regardless of whether it was possible or not, Brando's sword accurately struck his blade. What happened after that was a carbon copy of what happened before. 6 sword strikes in a row, and 2 gold-ranked swordsmen were easily killed by Brendel in a matter of seconds. In fact, it was not as easy for a normal person to kill a dog. For a moment, the entire left wing of the battlefield was silent. Brando pulled his sword out from the corpse of the second swordsman and wiped it on the latter's clothes before looking around. Wherever he looked, the noble soldiers of the Kruss family were so frightened that they retreated like a receding tide. Their fear was contagious, and it quickly turned into a message of despair. Brando moved forward, and thousands of soldiers screamed as if they had seen a ghost. The people at the front could not take it anymore. They threw down their weapons and ran away. At first, only a small portion of the soldiers were in front of Brando, but it destroyed the last of the Kruss family's confidence, and the soldiers began to scatter in large numbers. With one person as the center, they began to scatter. On the battlefield, Lord Cruss's personal guards and his knights were the ones who held the fort. Brando was still looking at him from afar, but the distance between them was less than 100 meters. However, both sides did not seem to have the intention to continue fighting. Brando stood under the encirclement of the wolves, and he saw the human knight in front of him opening a path for him. Behind him was Lord Cruss, who was fully equipped and mounted on his horse. In fact, Lord Cruss knew that he had lost, but he did not admit defeat. This knight, who had abandoned his comrades on the battlefield in Cantner, was now sitting on his horse with a long sword in his hand. He ordered everyone to stay, but he wanted to fight Brando alone. He held the long sword in his right hand, sat on the horse's back, and stretched out his left hand towards Brando. Brando looked at him and understood what he meant. This was a challenge. He nodded. Lord Cruss raised his long sword and shouted, "Erwin, your sword will always shine." The wolves also separated. Brando rode forward, but his speed was not fast. Lord Cruss rushed down the mountain, and Brando slowly ran up the mountain from the foot of the mountain. The two crossed paths. Brando directly transferred the long sword from his right hand to his left hand, and used Bahamut's claw to grab Lord Cruss's long sword. Without any fancy moves, he stabbed the long sword with his left hand into Lord Cruss's chest. With a bang, the huge force knocked Lord Cruss off his horse. This veteran of the November War rolled a few times on the ground, his face covered in dust. Using the last of his strength, he raised his head to look at the young man on the horse's back. "The glory you brought back, cough cough." The muffled voice under the mask said, "I accept it." Brando looked down at the man and said, "Actually, I came to tell you that they did not blame you. That war was not your fault." Lord Cruss froze. "How is that possible? Cough cough, you are not lying to me? You should know about the oak tree in Dakota's hometown. He asked me to let you take care of it." "His father planted it when he was young," Brando replied in a low voice. "It really is him, sob sob sob." The knight cried like a child. "I am sorry." Brando did not say anything. The November War itself was a mistake. He knew that Lord Cruss' story came from a quest in the game. Lord Cruss was full of remorse for his mistakes. 10 years later, he would issue this quest to all the players he recognized. It was a quest that everyone in the South knew. The quest's name was Atonement. Brando admired the old knight because he was willing to repent for his actions. In fact, he did not make any big mistakes on the battlefield in Cantner. He only carried out his orders. Lord Cruss wept and died. Brando sighed. The blood of Erwin's people flowed on the battlefield. He had no choice but to end the war. Perhaps only through the baptism of blood and fire could the kingdom be reborn. He raised his head and looked at the remaining Groton knights on the battlefield. "Leave," he said, "this is no longer your battlefield." But the knights shook their heads. "We don't know what you know, sir, but you have brought glory to our Lord. This is a noble act." "Thank you," the leader of the knights replied, "but this is where we will die." The sound of swords being unsheathed could be heard. Brando shook his head and turned around. The black wolves swarmed forward. The Highlanders fled out of fear. Lord Cruss died and Lord Cruss's army fell apart. The Grey Bear Lord was hesitant and refused to step forward. Madara did not make a move. But it was fine. Dead people were not to be trusted. The situation on the battlefield seemed to have reversed in the blink of an eye. It was such a solid advantage, but it was gone in a moment. There was a sense of loneliness in the forest. Lord Paulus, who was at the front line, suddenly felt a deep sense of fatigue. He looked around and saw the determination in the eyes of the knights around him. But the corpses of the soldiers on the battlefield were piled on top of each other. Broken spears and broken armors were everywhere. The tattered flags were dyed with the color of the setting sun. In fact, they had already failed. But he could still retreat to Lord Paulus. These rebels could not hold him back. As long as he was still there, he could reorganize the army. Although Madara was indecisive, they were still a force to be reckoned with. But victory was so close, as if it was at hand. It was so close, but why did it disappear in the blink of an eye? Or was it an unrealistic hope? I mean, what's going on? Everything he was familiar with was already far away, leaving behind only the taste of the past memories. The older knights took the younger knights to battle. Before the battle, they told the young Erwin's belief. This belief was passed down from generation to generation. Lord Paulus was once young. He still remembered the songs of the knights. But those ballads were no longer sung. The decaying kingdom was like a dilapidated wall, blocking out all light. The old knight seemed to see the light of new life piercing through the dark wall. He wanted to see the hope behind the wall, but before that he was destined to be crushed under the collapsing wall. After the news came from both sides of the battlefield, he lost control of the army. Most of the soldiers from the foreign territories fled. The lords and lords retreated to the back of the battlefield. Lord Paulus did not want to mock these cowards because it was meaningless. He led the 3,000 men of Lord Paulus's territory forward. The old knight's mask was stained with the blood of the setting sun. Now he was going to put an end to this war. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 490. Madara's proud and fearsome army did not dare to cross the line. This was because there were two people standing in front of the undead army, a man and a woman. The woman was an elf, proud and calm like the stars in the sky. She was young and did not seem to be able to show such a calm demeanor, but it did not affect her temperament as a commander. Medisha held a silver shuttle in her hand, holding her spear horizontally, and quietly stopped less than 100 steps away from Tarkus. In her eyes, Madara's army seemed to have disappeared. The man was a middle-aged swordsman. From beginning to end, he did not even look at Madara's army, but the tens of thousands of Madara's undead did not dare to ignore his existence. This was because he was Mephistopheles, the Grey Sword Saint. Lord Paulus has begun the charge. A black knight whispered in Tarkus's ear. Tarkus nodded. What did Lord Incersta say? Lord Paulus said Erwin has never lacked heroes. This is the choice of a soldier and we must respect the glory of the battlefield. The Black Knight replied in a low voice. Tarkus nodded. The vampire commander looked at Medisha, then at Mephistopheles and replied, Then let's retreat. I hope we can set foot on this land again in our lifetime. We are already dead, Lord Paulus, the Black Knight replied in a low voice. Tarkus thought for a moment and nodded. The figures of the undead disappeared from the forest bit by bit. There were only 2,000 people left on the battlefield. Their enemies were only a few hundred mercenaries, tree elves and centaurs. But the result was already decided. 2,000 low-level iron soldiers and less than 100 silver-level knights. Their enemies were hundreds of silver-level knights, and even silver-level knights who had survived the calamity of wolves. The Pegasi soared into the sky, and the tree elves' longbows did not miss their targets. It was a one-sided massacre on the battlefield. Lord Paulus felt a sharp pain in his heart when he heard the screams of the young man beside him. These were once Erwin's future that he believed belonged to. Yes, generation after generation Erwin, the older knight, led the younger knights to the battlefield, sang the knight's battle song, and brought them supreme glory. But the older knight found himself powerless. The assault had been stopped long ago. Just on this side of the battlefield alone, Lord Paulus saw at least 4 gold-rank combatants. A red-haired girl with a ponytail who used a spear, a tree elf, a centaur, and an unbelievably beautiful girl with short hair who was dressed in men's clothing. This was the so-called rebel army. At some point in time, the golden flags on the battlefield had been dyed with the color of blood. The old knight watched as the young faces disappeared from his sight. Suddenly he felt that it was time for this farce to end. Yes, it was time to end this. The spear in Scarlet's hand was no longer the original spear of lightning. The spear of lightning was lost in the dark forest and could not be found. What she was holding now was just an ordinary magic spear. Brando had promised her that he would help her find a suitable weapon after leaving the dark forest, but she did not want to trouble him with this matter. She was afraid that Brando would find her troublesome and despise her like Makarov did. But it was not a good idea to not have a weapon. She was now the strongest person in Brando's camp. Although she was still far from Mephisto's level, Mephisto was not actually one of Brando's men. At most he was an ally. As for Brando, although he was strong, he was only at the middle of gold rank. Scarlet, on the other hand, was at the peak of gold rank and was only one step away from stepping into the realm of elemental mastery. With her current strength, using an ordinary magic spear was already limiting her combat prowess. However, the girl was a little worried about her personal gains and losses. She gripped her spear tightly and pursed her lips as she slaughtered her way through Count Randner's remaining troops. The remnants of Count Randner's army were only Lord Paulus's own troops. The knight and gold-ranked swordsman reinforcements had already fled long ago. The remaining soldiers were not a threat to her at all. She and Mephistopheles weaved through the enemy's formation in an attempt to completely divide and defeat them. In fact, even Scarlet herself could feel that the enemy was at the end of their rope. At this moment, the spear in her hand trembled as she felt an obstruction in front of her. The girl was slightly startled. She raised her head, and a few people were reflected in her fiery eyes. To be more precise, it was a small group of knight. Lord Paulus's knight regiment. Scarlet's heart trembled. She knew that a silver-ranked knight was the backbone of an army. If she could destroy them first, then this war could end early. Thinking of this, she immediately rushed over there to kill. To her surprise, the other party's reaction was very fast, and he almost immediately noticed her intentions. 4 to 5 knight immediately surrounded her. Reckless. Scarlet furrowed her brows and thought to herself, these knights should be very clear of her strength. She was at the peak of gold rank and could not be compared to these silver-ranked knights. However, these knights did not hesitate when they charged towards her. She could only see determination in their eyes. They were all youths. Scarlet looked at the nervous faces of these youths and suddenly felt sorry for them. For a moment, she thought of her companions who had passed away. Her hands slowed down a little, and the murderous intent in her spear changed direction. Bang, 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 bang. The knight was knocked down from his horse. She continued to move forward, and a knight completely covered in armor appeared in the crowd. Scarlet noticed that the knight was only a silver-ranked, but he was unbelievably experienced. He actually dodged her spear. She did not think too much about it and immediately chased after him with her spear. However, she did not expect the knight to parry her spear with his sword and slash at her at the same time. Scarlet was a little nervous. She subconsciously thought that the enemy was a gold rank who was hiding his strength. She immediately retracted her spear and no longer held back. She feinted with her spear to deceive the enemy's center of gravity. Then she parried the enemy's sword with her spear and finally pierced the enemy's breastplate. The 3 consecutive spears did not have any room to stop. With a crisp sound, the spear instantly pierced through the enemy's breastplate and pierced through the enemy's body. High-grade magic armor? Scarlet immediately felt that something was wrong when she pierced through the enemy's breastplate. The magic armor he was wearing was not a normal knight's magic armor, but a higher-grade commander's armor. And in this army, there was only one person who could wear such a knight's armor. She was shocked, but she suddenly felt that her surroundings had quietened down. All the knight and soldiers of Count Randner who were fighting seemed to have stopped at this moment. At first, it was only the people around her, but the throbbing quickly spread out like a ripple, and the entire battlefield miraculously came to a standstill. Lord Paulus. A young man who just got up from the ground immediately rushed to the knight who fell under Scarlet's spear. The old knight who was lying in a pool of blood coughed violently. However, his first action was to remove his mask. It was a face that belonged to an old man. His face was full of wrinkles, and his snow-white eyebrows seemed to contain the hardships of this kingdom. His dim, gray eyes seemed to have seen too many storms. He had seen the knights who sang loudly in battle, the older knights who led the younger knights to the battlefield of no return, the glory and triumph that belonged to Erwin. He had also seen the defeat, the fall, and the final twilight of this kingdom. However, this kind of glory seemed to have fused into a pair of eyes that were flickering with the light of life that was fading away. It was as if everything of the past had returned. Lord Paulus smiled. He first waved his hand weakly at the knight beside him, then raised his head and asked Scarlet, "Little girl, where are you from? I don't believe that you are just ordinary rebels." Scarlet suddenly felt a little helpless. In theory, the old man in front of her was their greatest enemy in this battle, but at this moment she found that she was unable to reject his question. "I'm from Erwin," she replied. "Impossible. Peak gold ranked. Peak gold ranked. When did Erwin have such a young genius? A true genius?" The old man shook his head weakly. "I'm really from Erwin. I'm a Highlander from Randner. I used to be a mercenary and it was Lord Paulus who took me in," Scarlet said seriously. "Such stubbornness, the stubbornness of an Aween citizen. I'm starting to believe that you're an Aween citizen." The old man smiled, but his smile seemed to have used up the last of its splendor. "But why would a genius like you be willing to serve in the rebel army? No, there is no such thing as submission. Lord Paulus is better than me. But even so, he is very good to everyone. Compared to Grodin, I think he is the best lord." Scarlet replied seriously. "Is that so? What is your Lord Paulus called? Cough name?" "His name is Brando." "Brando? Brando?" Lord Paulus closed his eyes and suddenly let out a long sigh. He felt his limbs gradually turning cold and he lost consciousness. Even his breathing became difficult. But the old man still had one last question. He looked at the battlefield and saw the blood flowing in the forest. It was Erwin's blood. "What purpose do you have here?" "I don't know, but Lord Paulus said that he is here to save Erwin." "Save Erwin?" Lord Paulus's eyes lit up. He looked at Scarlet with a complicated gaze. How do we save her? Scarlet shook her head. I don't know, but I believe that Lord Paulus can do it. Just like how no one believes that you nobles can do it. We nobles? Ah. Cough cough cough. The old knight suddenly laughed and shook his head with the last of his strength. Well said. Listen to my orders, my knights. Surrender. His words were like rolling thunder, and all the young knight were stunned. Impossible, Lord Paulus. If you die here, we will die here too. This is our honor. No, the old man weakly closed his eyes. He spoke softly as if he was using the last of his strength. You must surrender. This is for Erwin's honor. For Erwin's unparalleled honor. P.S. I promise you that the explosion is coming. Everyone, please support me with your votes and give me some motivation. I'm rolling on the ground looking for motivation. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 492. Count Randner lost? The parchment in Oberway's hand slipped to the ground, and he had to grab it before he could regain his footing. He raised his head and revealed a look of surprise. Princess Griffin listened to the news without batting an eyelid. The outcome of the battle in the south was not announced immediately. Count Randner's army was routed, and the people around him were speechless for a moment. The losses of the Allied army were not that great. Most of the soldiers fled with the frightened mountain people, and the army of the Grizzly Bear territory was unscathed. The real losses were only a few thousand noble soldiers under Lord Cruss and Lord Paulus. However, the deaths of Lord Paulus, Wade, and Lord Cruss caused the entire southern territory to whisper to each other. Countless nobles of various sizes died in the battle. 2 of them were feudal lords, and 1 of them was a trusted retainer of Count Randner. The forces in Tonagel and the northern regions were emptied. Even if Count Randner wanted to, he would not be able to form another army to attack Abes. Unless he personally led an army, but that was impossible. Which feudal lord did not have enemies? Count Randner had to constantly be on guard against his enemies taking advantage of the situation to attack him. Especially at this time, everyone thought that he was a tiger that had lost its fangs, and even his internal organs were beginning to stir. Even though Count Randner hated Brendel to the core, he had to solve his own problems first before he could spare a hand to deal with Brendel. When Count Randner had the time to take action, Brando felt that he would not have to be afraid of him at all. His original goal could be said to be at least half achieved at this moment. At the end of the month of the winter zither, when the flowers bloomed in February and the earth began to thaw, Erwin was discussing the battle everywhere. Only Tonagel was quiet, and the other side that participated in the battle rarely talked about it. Abes had also paid a heavy price in the battle, especially the mercenaries who delayed Count Randner's army. They lost more than half of their men. Some of the veterans who had experienced the November War did not bow down to that tragic war, but they were buried on the banks of the Gree River. Their graves were now in a pine forest as quiet as a poem. However, the shadow of war was soon washed away by the green wheat sprouts in the fields after the snow and ice melted. After a winter, Wound regained its vitality and vigor. This made people realize in disbelief that they had won. They won just like that. I didn't even have the chance to enter the battlefield. Carglass sat on a bench with his hands behind his head as he watched Odom and the Aween's royal blacksmith Grandmaster Bosley circling around a pile of scrap metal. At least to him, it was just scrap metal and it was just a bunch of broken swords. The most direct harvest from this battle was the large number of armors and weapons abandoned by the nobles. These were the things that Abes lacked the most, and Bosley estimated that they would be able to equip an army of 3,000 to 4,000 men. There's still a bunch of junk in my dimension that I collected from the ruins in the Loop of Trade Winds, so I decided to pour them all out. The result was that Bosley's blacksmith shop almost exploded from the sheer amount of junk that he had collected from the ruins in the Loop of Trade Winds. Bosley flew into a rage and chased Carglass and Bosley out of the house. Carglass had taken over Scarlet's position as captain of the White Lion Legion's NCO training and had been following Bosley around all day. But a moment later, the blacksmith ran out again and grabbed Brendel's hand with glowing eyes. "My lord, where did you get all these weapons from? You didn't rob an Empire's warehouse, did you?" Brando flung his hand away. "Do you think that the Empire's warehouses are public toilets that you can enter and leave as you please? Even if it's a public toilet, you still have to pay to enter. Isn't that because you're my lord? Everyone says that there's nothing you can't do. Look, everyone is calling you the miracle creator Brando," Bosley said with a smile. "But then again, what's a public toilet?" Brando furrowed his brows. Who gave him such a vulgar title? What, miracle creator Brando? He sounded like the main character in those third-rate night novels. He thought that he would at least have a title like Wolf Herder. Titles were very important to a person's reputation. For example, Wolf Baron, Oberway or Crosshand, Buga. Most people would know that it was related to the person's personality and ability. If a normal person was called Dead Maggot or Rotten Toe, Brando would rather find a pillar and kill himself. But Cargly's eyes lit up when he heard the vulgar title. He couldn't help but grumble, "Damn it, if I knew that I would come out with my lord, I might have a title too." What title? For example, my lord is called Miracle Creator Brando. Of course, I wouldn't dare to compare myself to my lord, so I'll be called Cargly's follower of Miracle Creator Brando. The young man thought for a while and said seriously. Brando staggered and almost fell to his knees. He immediately looked at the noble descendant of Erwin, the second son of Lord Maxon, with a look of disdain. He couldn't help but worry about the future of the kingdom. What kind of twisted aesthetic is this? For the sake of his future captain and the White Lion Legion, he decided to correct Cargly's aesthetic attitude. It's just a small matter. There will be plenty of opportunities to fight in the future. I just hope that you won't complain when the time comes. Really? Of course, Brando replied. Our enemies aren't just our own people but also Madara. Madara didn't even use their regular army in this war. Do you know why? Madara didn't use their regular army? Bosley didn't experience the first war of the Black Roses in the dungeon, but Cargly's had more or less heard about this war. The young man couldn't help but widen his eyes. Madara invaded Erwin because of the endless internal disputes and unequal distribution of benefits. The new emperor ascended the throne, and the court was in turmoil. In order to divert the internal conflicts, Madara expanded outwards. In fact, the real war was just a legal plunder. The only ones who acted were the nobles. Brando replied seriously, "It's just that this expansion is the external manifestation of Madara's internal changes over the past 10 years. The Black Knight of Madara, Insursta, received the support of the Targus family due to his talent and entered Erwin to seek the capital to rise to the top. Before that, he was just a young man who had just inherited the territory. In this war there are many young men like him in Madara. Insursta isn't the only one." This was the first time Brando spoke frankly about Madara's threat to his subordinates. In fact, he knew that he wasn't exaggerating. Bosley and Cargly's both gasped. How strong is the real Madara? The main forces of Madara's regular army are the Black Knight, the Dark Crusader, the Vampires and the High Necromancers. The Black Knight and the Dark Crusader are at the bottom of the hierarchy in Madara's regular army. Their strength is at least above the silver rank. Normally I would call them tier 3 soldiers. Brando replied, "As for the high-ranking forces, there are the Bone Dragons, the Vengeful Banshees and the Blood Throne Lords. If Erwin had relied on the Temple Guards, the earliest White Lion Knights, and the Iron Horse Knights created by the late King Eric, they might have had a chance. But now, Brando left some things unsaid. In fact, Madara wasn't the strongest force in the world yet. Whether it was the Cruz Empire, Saint Tassol, or the Craftsmen of Buga, they were all much stronger than this new Dark Empire. At the very least, Buga's gargoyles and gemstone dragons had once dominated the battlefield. Buga's sky is the sky of the world." Such domineering words could only be uttered by the artisan mages. It's a pity that the training methods of the Iron Horse Knight have long been lost. Grandmaster Bosley sighed, "Even the training methods of the White Lion Infantry have been lost many years ago, and the strength of the White Lion Infantry is much weaker than before." Brando nodded. He naturally knew this. The White Lion Infantry was the army that followed the late King Eric to conquer the world. Now that they were reduced to the level of Count Ranner's personal guards, it could be said that it was the will of heaven. Erwin had gone against King Eric's path, and thus received such a punishment. The Temple Guards were the product of the alliance between the Silver Elves and Erwin. Medisha was one of the products of this alliance, but the alliance was long gone. Erwin's people even misinterpreted the Holy Covenant and caused Martha's wrath. However, the complicated relationship between Erwin, the Silver Elves, and the Wind Elves allowed the kingdom to survive until today. It was only after Madara's invasion that the world saw Erwin's weakness that the kingdom gradually declined. But that was all in the past. Brando patted their shoulders. "Don't be afraid, we can take it slow. The kingdom is not without hope." The training methods of the White Lion Infantry were lost in the war between the House of Cipher and the House of Corvado, **. It is said that the descendants of the House of Cipher divided the training methods into 3 parts and brought them to the tombs around Monstro. If we have the time we can go look for it. Asterisk Year of Summer, New Moon War. Grandmaster Bosley thought that Brando was comforting him, but he did not know that what Brando said was true. The descendants of the House of Cipher divided the training methods into 3 parts and gave them to the 3 princes and princesses. One of the parts was recovered, and the other part was found in the tombs of Monstro. As for the last part, its whereabouts were unknown. The complete set of White Lion Infantry was said to be a Class 4 unit, but 2 of them would be Class 3 at the very least. Brando could also think of a way to train the Iron Horse Knight. This was one of the advantages of transmigrating. Now that he had some free time, he had to start preparing for this. However, he first called Bosley back to reality and asked, "Grandmaster, the armor of the Crimson Banner Cavalry is quite good. Can you think of a way to improve it?" Improve it? Bosley was puzzled. Even though the armor's defense is high, it's not suitable for heavy infantry, especially since it only strengthens the defense of the arrows. It's a little against the ideals of the White Lion Infantry. No, I want you to help me modify it so that archers can wear it. Brando shook his head. Archers? Bosley's eyes widened. He had never heard of anyone being so extravagant that even archers had to wear magic armor. It wasn't that archers weren't precious, but their position was too low. Using magic armor on them was too wasteful. Isn't this too extravagant? Not at all. What if they're the ones wearing it? Brando had Bosley turn around and pointed at a few tall tree elf girls with bows on their backs. They were strolling through the streets of the human world, and looking around curiously. Then, Bosley couldn't find the words to object this time. Everyone knew that elven archers were all godly archers. However, he couldn't imagine what an archer wearing magic armor would look like. In theory, an archer's goal was to be agile. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 493. It wasn't difficult for Bosley, who had been working with Ironfelt for decades, to modify the armor into an archer's armor. Archers had to be flexible in their waist, upper arms, and back, or their accuracy would be affected. Bosley removed a part of the armor and replaced it with flexible plates. The next day he produced a sample. Quinn put on his armor and stretched his upper body, revealing a satisfied expression. The tree elves were tall and muscular, but Bosley's armor fit them perfectly. It was just that the armor that was supposed to be worn by human cavalrymen was a little too small for the tree elves. It looked a little like the armor worn by the Romans. It's a little too heavy. There's no way to reduce the weight, Bosley said. No matter how much the armor was modified, the weight of the armor would always fall on the shoulders. However, if the archer's shoulders were too heavy, it would greatly affect their accuracy. Bosley turned to look at his lord, waiting for Brando's response. Brando placed his thumb and middle finger under his chin and looked at the armor with satisfaction. The armor was like a work of art. After Bosley modified the armor's plates, the plates floated up with Quinn's movements and sparkled under the light. Just give me a weight-reducing prefix. Grandmaster Bosley, can you make a few more samples? He turned to Bosley and asked. A prefix was a type of enchantment, and there were several types of weight-reducing prefixes. Freya's Wind Dance from the half-plate of the wind armor was the best. Not only would the wearer not feel the weight of the armor, he would even feel as if he was surrounded by a gentle breeze, increasing his agility. That's not a problem. Why do you need so many samples? You'll find out soon enough. In fact, Bosley hoped that he would never find out. He watched as Brando took the armor from Quinn's hands and burned it in his hands. The intense magical reaction turned into bright sparks that shot out in all directions. Crackle, crackle, crackle. The armor melted and formed a huge hole in the armor. It looked like the scene after a candle melted. The metal melted into liquid and sank inwards. The liquid state then solidified again, leaving behind a hole the size of a fist. Brando shrugged. No matter how he looked at it, the armor in his hands was ruined. Alchemy was a job with a high degree of randomness, especially when he wanted to figure out an effective wind elemental magic formation. He could only use the finished product to fill in the gaps. In the next few days, the green flames in the furnace never went out, and the clanging sounds in the smithy never stopped. One set of modified armor after another turned into scrap metal in Brendel's hands. He began to use the cheap wind azurite as the magic core of the wind magic circle. This kind of gem was the most common main material in Vaunt that contained wind elemental magic. It was also the cheapest kind. Although it was called a gem, it was actually cheaper than most magic crystals. Even in the past, when inflation was at its peak, This kind of gem could only be sold for a few thousand tor. However, the results of his experiments were not ideal. The best result he got from the wind azurite was the clumsy prefix. The weight reduction never exceeded 5%, and there were all kinds of negative effects. Brando then tried using celestial stone, green olive, and azure crystal. Each material was more expensive than the last, and the weight reduction increased from 10% to 15%. On the morning of the 5th day, Brando and Bosley, who had dark circles under their eyes, finally came up with the lightweight prefix. Lightweight archer armor. Defense +4, arrow resistance +2, weight reduction 20%. However, it was still much heavier than expected. Quinn also said that only the best archers among the tree elves could wear it in battle without any hindrance, but most people could not reach that level. At this time, the rate of archer armor that was modified from the Crimson Banner Cavalry's armor had already reached 10%. This result was obviously not what Brando wanted. His goal was to raise the strength of the tree elves' archers to at least rank 3. The strength of a unit was based on a few numbers: attack, defense, mobility, and special abilities. As for increasing attack power, Brando could only do so if he could create a tree elven longbow. That was the standard equipment for the tree elves' archers, but it was a product that was almost 50 years in the future. Moreover, he did not know anything about making bows, so he might as well think of a way to increase his defense. However, it seemed that it was not realistic to equip the tree elves with new armor. At the very least, there was a bottleneck when it came to weight. If this problem was not solved, it would be impossible to equip the tree elves with new armor. The solution was to increase the lightweight prefix to agile. That way, a 30% weight reduction would be enough to meet his requirements. However, the cost of modifying the armor had already exceeded 30,000 tor coins. If it continued to increase, Brando believed that Amandina would come to him to hand in her resignation letter. There's no other way. Grandmaster Bosley was sprawled on his workbench, his hair messy like a bird's nest. This is the limit. If we don't increase the weight, it'll affect our defense. Grandmaster Bosley muttered weakly as he lay on his workbench. Let's equip the elites of the tree elves first, Tamar suggested. He was invited by Brando to participate in the plan. The future master alchemist had been helping Amandina and Seal design the mage tower that they had been planning for a long time. Amandina's magicite laboratory was also part of the plan. Magic was an important resource in Won's world, and the importance of a wizard tower to a territory was self-evident. Moreover, the wizard tower could gather mana from the public mana pool. Not only could it greatly increase the strength of the spellcasters under him, it could also speed up the development of wizard apprentices. Even the lowest level alchemy laboratory could provide the alchemists working in it with an additional alchemy level bonus. An advanced alchemy laboratory was equivalent to directly providing the lord with a number of professional alchemists. As long as there was a little bit of money, there was no lord who would not be willing to build a wizard tower in his territory. Moreover, a good mage tower could attract even more mages to become his subordinates and advisors, so why not? Originally, Brando did not want to delay Tamar's progress. But with his black hole of funds, Amandina had no choice but to ask Tamar to help. Otherwise, she was worried that Brando would use the entire territory's wealth to create a super army. In her opinion, her lord seemed to be such a militaristic person, as if he never had a sense of security and always prioritized the development of military power. But Brando still shook his head at Tamar's suggestion. He did not want a small group of elites. In fact, he did not lack such elites. He had the Planeswalker system and the Nest system. If possible, he could form an elite army by himself. What he needed was a main force. A main force like the centaurs, subterranean dwellers, and tree elves. And this main force had to be able to stand firm in the upcoming war. He thought for a moment and replied, "Continue to experiment and see if you can use the same materials to create better enchantments. I'll think of other ways." Brando's method was simple. It was the Dragon Blood Potion. Just like what Quinn said, the tree elves' final product was not completely useless, but it would more or less limit their combat strength. In other words, it was still a matter of weight. But for armor, other than reducing the weight, why not increase the weight of the tree elves? When it came to increasing strength, Brando could not think of anything else other than the Dragon Blood Potion. However, the first batch of Dragon Blood Potion was given to the future officers of the White Lion Legion. The second batch was given to the mercenaries, centaurs, and the tree elf archers to deal with the upcoming battle. There were only a few tree elves, only a few hundred of them. The tree elves in the forest could at least form an army of 1,000. Similarly, Brando did not only want to create rank 3 tree elves, but also the centaurs. This way he would need thousands of bottles of dragon blood potion. This was not a small number. The blood from the multi-headed dragon would definitely not be enough, and Brando needed to find more materials. There wasn't enough time to acquire them, and Brando didn't want this to drag down his trip to Ampere Seal. He quickly thought of a way, and that was to breed the multi-headed dragon himself. And when it came to breeding the multi-headed dragon himself, it was natural to use a nest. But normal territories did not have enough space to accommodate a nest. For example, Abes did not have a natural place to gather mana. Brando naturally placed his plans on Valhalla. Speaking of which, ever since he left the Dark Forest, it seemed that it was time for him to rebuild this fortress that had borne countless glories. Brando simply threw the blacksmith's workshop to Bosley and Tamar, and buried himself in the research of the core magic circle of Valhalla. The core magic circle of Valhalla was not complicated, but it required a large number of magic crystals. If this was in the past, Brando would have gone crazy. But at this time, the first batch of people who went to the Black Forest had already returned. Under the protection of the mercenaries, the immigrants built a small mine in the forest. Although the first batch of magic crystals mined was not much, it was enough to satisfy Brando's initial needs. But although Brando was wholeheartedly focused on the magic circle, it was not to the point where he could not extricate himself from the outside world. He knew very well that at this time in history, Princess Griffine should be preparing to go to Ampere Seal to negotiate with Duke Arek. Since the month of spring's dawn in the Year of the Sword, Princess Griffine had already reached a certain degree of agreement with Duke Arek. He was actually a little hesitant about whether he should let the princess and Arek meet first. After all, with Arek in the north in front of them, Tanajil would not be the first to fall into the biggest whirlpool of the battle for the throne. But Brando quickly made up his mind. As the princess's supporter, he would not allow history to repeat itself. Since he had already made up his mind to put on a good show when the princess went to Ampere Seal, the stage this time was naturally the largest trading port in Erewhon. The time had been set, and everything he was doing now was actually to prepare for the upcoming trip. Brando did not put down the work at hand, but sent the Shire and his subordinates out to look for planeswalker cards. He was very clear that he could not bring an army to Ampere Seal, and even the Black Wolves could not follow. The only things he could rely on were the planeswalker system and his own strength. But after the battle in the Black Forest, the planeswalker system was now in a semi-crippled state. In order to revive the system, Brando knew that he first needed a new method of digging up graves. He planned all of this. Starting from the end of the month of the Winter Harp, the upgrading of the army, the rebuilding of Valhalla, and the search for planeswalker cards were all carried out in an orderly manner. To outsiders, Tanajil seemed unusually quiet, but inside, slow and shocking changes were taking place. This silence lasted until the first week of the month of spring's dawn, when a piece of news was sent to Brando's desk. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.